Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? The town of Millbrook sits nestled in a valley where rolling hills meet weathered farmland, connected to the wider world by a single winding road that curves past old stone walls and stands of maple trees. In the early morning hours, when mist rises from the creek that gives the town its name, the silence feels almost sacred, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the soft whisper of wind through grain fields. It was in this peaceful setting, 3 years ago now, that something happened which changed the rhythm of daily life forever. Not in dramatic ways that outsiders might notice, but in the subtle shifts that longtime residents feel in their bones. The way conversations pause a moment longer at the post office. The manner in which evening walks end a little earlier than they once did. The quiet that settles over the town square when shadows grow long. Margaret Chun had lived in Millbrook for 47 years, arriving as a young bride in 1976 when her husband took over management of the grain elevator. Her house on Elm Street sat behind a white picket fence that she painted every third spring, a ritual as dependable as the changing seasons. The front garden bloomed with carefully tended roses, and the backyard stretched to a vegetable patch where she grew tomatoes and beans that she shared with neighbors each summer. On the morning of September 15th, 3 years past, Margaret did not appear at her usual time to collect the newspaper from her front step. The paperboy, young Timothy Walsh, noticed because Margaret always waved to him from her kitchen window as he pedaled past. Her morning routine was as fixed as clockwork: coffee at 6:30, newspaper by 7, garden watering by 8 if the weather was fair. By mid-morning, when Margaret's closest friend Eleanor Hartwell tried calling to confirm their weekly trip to the farmer's market, the phone rang without answer. Eleanor, a retired schoolteacher who lived 2 streets over, walked to Margaret's house and found the newspaper still lying in the dewy grass, the front door locked, curtains drawn tight against the autumn light. The local sheriff, a methodical man named Robert Hayes who had known both women since childhood, arrived within the hour. He walked the perimeter of the house slowly, noting the undisturbed flower beds, the locked windows, the car still parked in the gravel driveway. Everything appeared exactly as it should, except for Margaret's absence. Inside the house, Sheriff Hayes found further evidence of normalcy interrupted. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the kitchen table beside a cooling cup of coffee. Margaret's reading glasses rested nearby, folded neatly on top of a book about rose cultivation. Her purse sat on the counter, contents undisturbed. Upstairs, her bed had been made with the same precision she brought to all her domestic tasks. In the days that followed, the investigation expanded beyond Millbrook's borders. State police officers interviewed neighbors, searched the surrounding countryside, and followed leads that stretched across 3 counties. Margaret's photograph appeared in regional newspapers and on television broadcasts that reached the state capital. Her family, a sister in California, a nephew in Ohio, traveled to Millbrook to assist in the search efforts. But as autumn deepened into winter, the active investigation gradually wound down. The state police returned to their regular duties. The family members went back to their distant lives. The newspaper clippings were filed away in basement boxes. Yet Margaret's absence continued to shape the town's daily rhythms in ways both seen and unseen. Mrs. Patterson, who lived across the street from Margaret's house, found herself pausing longer at her living room window each morning, unconsciously maintaining a vigil that had begun during those first uncertain days. The sight of Margaret's dark windows, season after season, became a permanent fixture in her morning routine, as much a part of the landscape as the old oak tree that shaded both their properties. At Henderson's General Store, where Margaret had shopped twice weekly for 30 years, her usual items, Earl Grey tea, whole wheat bread, fresh lemons, took on an almost memorial quality. Store owner Jim Henderson found himself restocking these products, even though sales had dropped, maintaining inventory for a customer who would never return. Sometimes, in quiet moments between other customers, he would glance toward the tea aisle and remember Margaret's particular way of examining each box before making her selection. The Millbrook Ladies' Auxiliary, which Margaret had served as treasurer for over a decade, struggled to reorganize their financial records. Her meticulous bookkeeping had been so thorough, so precisely maintained, that unraveling her system proved nearly impossible. Bank statements, donation receipts, and expense records were all organized according to a logic that had died with her disappearance. The auxiliary's charitable work continued, but with a subtle inefficiency that served as a constant reminder of Margaret's absent competence. Even the physical landscape of the town bore traces of her vanishing. Her rose garden, which had been a source of neighborhood pride, gradually succumbed to neglect despite occasional efforts by well-meaning friends. The careful pruning schedule she had maintained was lost knowledge, and the roses grew wild and then sparse, their blooming becoming irregular and eventually ceasing altogether. Where once had been a display of disciplined beauty, now grew a tangle of thorns and overgrown grass that seemed to embody the mystery of her fate. Children who had been too young to remember, Margaret directly grew up aware of her story through overheard conversations and hushed references. To them, the empty house on Elm Street became a landmark of inexplicable sadness, a place where something unnamed had gone wrong in the adult world they were still learning to navigate. They walked past it on their way to school with a mixture of curiosity and unease, their childish imaginations filling the silence with possibilities, both mundane and fantastical. The annual Millbrook Harvest Festival, held each October in the town square, took on a different character after Margaret's disappearance. What had once been an unqualified celebration of community and abundance now carried an undertone of incompleteness. Margaret's absence was felt most keenly at the bake sale booth, where she had contributed her famous apple pies for 15 consecutive years. Other bakers stepped forward to fill the gap, but their offerings, however well-intentioned, could not replicate the particular combination of spices and technique that had made Margaret's pies a festival tradition. Sheriff Hayes, now approaching retirement age, continued to receive occasional tips and leads about Margaret's case. Most proved to be false alarms, misidentified women in distant cities, well-meaning but mistaken witnesses, amateur detectives with theories based on internet research rather than facts. He followed each lead with professional thoroughness, but the trail had grown cold within the first 6 months, and he knew that unless extraordinary circumstances arose, the case would remain forever open and forever unsolved. The Chun family's grain elevator, which Margaret's late husband had managed for nearly 2 decades, continued operating under new ownership, but the transition had not been seamless. The new managers, a young couple from the state capital, brought modern efficiency and updated equipment, but they lacked the deep community connections that had made Margaret's husband such an effective liaison between the farmers and the grain buyers. Business relationships that had been built on handshakes and mutual trust required renegotiation and formal contracts, changing the tenor of commerce in subtle but lasting ways. Margaret's house itself became a subject of quiet debate among town residents. The bank that held the mortgage was legally obligated to maintain the property, but minimal upkeep meant gradual deterioration. Paint began to peel from the shutters. The lawn grew long and was cut irregularly by a hired service that had no investment in its appearance. The white picket fence, once Margaret's pride, developed gaps where boards warped and pulled away from their supports. Some residents felt the empty house should be sold and occupied by a new family, allowing the neighborhood to heal and move forward. Others believed it should be preserved as Margaret had left it, a kind of memorial to her unexplained fate. The debate never reached the level of town meetings or formal discussions, but it simmered in coffee shop conversations and backyard fence visits, another layer of complexity added to the community's processing of loss. Dr. Patricia Reeves, Millbrook's only physician, noticed changes in her patients that seemed connected to Margaret's disappearance. though she was careful not to draw direct correlations without evidence. Sleep disturbances increased among middle-aged women. Requests for anxiety medication rose slightly but persistently. Several longtime patients began scheduling more frequent checkups, as if Margaret's sudden absence had reminded them of their own mortality and vulnerability. The local library, housed in a converted Victorian mansion on the town's main street, became an unofficial repository for materials related to Margaret's case. Newspaper clippings, missing person flyers, and copies of police reports were collected in a folder that grew thicker with each passing month. Librarian Sarah Walsh, Timothy's mother, maintained this informal archive without any official mandate, driven by a sense that the community's memory of Margaret deserved careful preservation. Visitors to Millbrook, though few in number, sometimes noticed the subtle atmosphere of incompleteness that had settled over the town. The bed and breakfast that served the occasional tourist or traveling salesperson was run by Helen Martinez, who had been Margaret's friend and bridge partner for over 20 years. Helen found herself sharing Margaret's story with guests, not because they asked, but because the weight of untold history seemed to demand expression. These conversations with strangers served a therapeutic function for Helen and others in the community. Speaking about Margaret to people outside, Millbrook allowed residents to process their grief and confusion without the complicated dynamics that existed between neighbors who had all been affected by the loss. Visitors listened with polite interest and then departed, taking the story with them like seeds that might bloom into concern or remembrance in distant places. The seasons continued their ancient cycle, indifferent to human mysteries. Spring brought renewed growth to the abandoned garden, but it was the random growth of weeds and volunteer plants rather than the carefully planned succession of blooms that Margaret had orchestrated. Summer heat beat down on the empty house, causing the wooden siding to expand and contract in ways that created small structural stresses. Autumn brought leaves that accumulated on the roof and in the gutters, beginning the slow process of decay that would continue without intervention. Winter was perhaps the most difficult season for those who remembered Margaret clearly. The house stood dark and cold while neighboring homes glowed with warm light and showed signs of active habitation. Snow accumulated on Margaret's roof and remained there, unmarked by foot traffic or maintenance activity. The contrast between life and abandonment was starkest during these months, when the physical needs of shelter and warmth made human presence most apparent by its absence. Children sledding on the hill behind Elm Street learned to avoid the area near Margaret's backyard, not because it was forbidden, but because something in the atmosphere discouraged lingering. Their parents never explicitly warned them away from the property, but the children absorbed the adults' unease through subtle cues and learned to direct their play elsewhere. The backyard that had once welcomed neighborhood kids seeking lost baseballs or quick shortcuts became a space avoided by mutual, unspoken agreement. The town's rhythm of social gatherings adapted to Margaret's absence in ways both practical and emotional. The monthly potluck dinners at the community center established new seating arrangements that didn't leave obvious gaps. The church choir, where Margaret had sung alto for 25 years, recruited new members to fill the harmonic space she had occupied. These adjustments were made gradually and without fanfare, the community's unconscious healing process, working to restore functional wholeness while preserving emotional memory. Local businesses that had depended on Margaret's regular patronage experienced minor but persistent changes. The hardware store lost a customer who had purchased gardening supplies with seasonal regularity. The bookstore missed her weekly visits and her recommendations to other customers seeking gardening advice. The impact was not economically significant, but it contributed to the sense that the town's commercial ecosystem had been subtly altered by her disappearance. Margaret's involvement in various community organizations created administrative challenges that persisted long after her vanishing. She had served on the planning committee for the annual Memorial Day parade, maintained the membership roster for the Historical Society, and coordinated the holiday food drive that supplied local families with Thanksgiving and Christmas meals. Other volunteers stepped forward to assume these responsibilities, but Margaret's institutional knowledge, the relationships, precedents, and informal agreements that made community projects successful was irreplaceable. The mystery of Margaret's fate became woven into Millbrook's sense of identity in ways that residents were still discovering years later. Casual conversations with outsiders inevitably included some reference to the unsolved disappearance, as if the town's story could not be told completely without acknowledging this central absence. Margaret became Millbrook's most famous resident precisely because she was no longer a resident at all, her legend growing in inverse proportion to the available facts about her. Destiny. Young people who had grown up with Margaret's story began leaving Millbrook at higher rates than previous generations, though whether this was connected to her disappearance or simply reflected broader economic and social trends was impossible to determine. Some longtime residents worried that the town was becoming associated with inexplicable tragedy, making it less attractive to young families who might otherwise settle in the area. Others felt that confronting mystery and loss was part of the human condition, and that Millbrook's response to adversity demonstrated the community's fundamental strength. The investigation files, stored in a cabinet at the county sheriff's office, contained hundreds of pages of interviews, photographs, and official reports, but they had yielded no definitive answers. The case remained technically active, subject to renewed investigation if significant new evidence emerged, but in practical terms, it had entered the realm of historical mystery. Sheriff Hayes occasionally reviewed the materials, hoping that time and perspective might reveal connections that had been invisible during the initial investigation, but each review confirmed the thoroughness of the original work and the genuine absence of conclusive leads. Margaret's story had become part of Millbrook's oral tradition, passed down through family conversations and community gatherings, with the consistency and variation typical of folklore. Details were embellished or forgotten according to the storyteller's memory and audience, but the central mystery remained constant. A well-known, well-liked member of the community had simply vanished without explanation, leaving behind no clues about her fate or her reasons for leaving. The psychological impact of this unresolved loss created subtle changes in how residents viewed their own safety and the predictability of their lives. If someone as rooted in the community as Margaret could disappear without warning, then perhaps the stability that rural life seemed to offer was more fragile than anyone had previously imagined. This realization did not create panic or widespread anxiety, but it added a layer of philosophical uncertainty to daily decisions about trust, security, and the reliability of human connections. As the third anniversary of Margaret's disappearance approached, the community prepared to mark the date with a combination of remembrance and resignation. The memorial service planned for that September evening would be simple and brief, reflecting both the town's grief and its acceptance that some questions might never be answered. The service would conclude with a moment of silence, allowing each person present to remember Margaret in their own way while acknowledging the continuing mystery of her fate. In the quiet that would follow that silence, Millbrook would begin another day of ordinary life shadowed by extraordinary absence. The routine activities of a small rural community, carrying forward the weight of unanswered questions and the memory of a woman whose story had become inseparable from the town's own identity. The morning mist would rise again from the creek. The sun would illuminate familiar streets and buildings, and life would continue in the spaces between remembrance and forgetting, between hope and acceptance, between the known and the unknowable. The clock tower above the town square, which had marked time for Millbrook residents for over a century, would continue its steady rhythm, indifferent to human mysteries, but somehow comforting in its reliability. Each chime would mark another moment in the ongoing story of a community learning to live with loss, to find meaning in uncertainty, and to maintain hope despite the absence of answers. Margaret's house would remain empty, its windows dark, its garden wild, standing as a permanent question mark in the landscape of a town that had learned to carry mystery as part of its daily burden and its deepest character. And in that carrying, in that patient endurance of the unknown, Millbrook would continue to exist as a place where ordinary people confronted extraordinary circumstances with quiet dignity and persistent grace. The story of Margaret Chun's disappearance would live on in the collective memory of Millbrook, not as a tale with a beginning, middle, and end, but as an ongoing presence in the life of the community. It would be remembered in the turning of seasons, the changing of generations, and the steady passage of days that constituted the real history of a small town learning to live with questions that had no answers and losses that could not be explained. In the end, Margaret's absence had become a presence of its own, woven into the fabric of Millbrook's identity as thoroughly as any building or landmark. Her story would be told and retold, each telling a small act of remembrance and resistance against the forgetting that time inevitably brings. And in that telling, in that refusal to let mystery erase memory, the town would find its own quiet way of honoring both the woman who had vanished and the community that continued to hold space for her. Return, the Clearwater River winds through the heart of Riverside County like a silver ribbon, connecting a dozen small communities along its meandering path toward the distant sea. In the county seat of Riverside Falls, the courthouse sits on a bluff overlooking the water, its limestone walls weathered by decades of rain and wind into a comfortable patina that speaks of endurance and permanence. It was in the basement of this courthouse, in a storage room that had accumulated forgotten files for over half a century, that Deputy Clerk Martha Stevens made a discovery that would quietly reshape the understanding of several cold cases that had long been relegated to historical curiosity. The discovery came about through the most mundane of circumstances, a leak in the building's aging plumbing that required workers to move boxes and filing cabinets to prevent water damage. Martha had worked in the courthouse for 28 years, long enough to develop an intimate knowledge of the building's quirks and the bureaucratic archaeology that accumulated in any institution handling decades of legal records. She was methodical by nature, the kind of person who found satisfaction in organizing chaos and creating order from confusion. When the maintenance crew asked her to supervise the temporary relocation of files, she saw it as an opportunity to catalog and reorganize materials that had been largely ignored for years. The boxes in question dated back to the 1970s and contained a mixture of closed cases, administrative records, and miscellaneous documents that previous clerks had been reluctant to discard, but uncertain how to properly archive. Most contained exactly what Martha expected: property disputes, minor criminal cases, civil suits that had been settled decades earlier. But one box, marked simply Miscellaneous 1978 to 1982, contained materials that told a more complex story. Among the routine paperwork were 3 separate case files that had been bundled together, apparently by someone who had noticed connections that were not immediately obvious to casual observers. The files concerned incidents that had occurred in different communities along the Clearwater River, separated by both geography and time, but linked by patterns that became visible only when examined together. The first file documented the disappearance of David Riley, a maintenance worker for the County Highway Department who had vanished during a routine road inspection trip in March 1979. David was 42 years old, married with 2 teenage children, known for his reliability and attention to detail. His county truck had been found parked beside Route 7 near the Millfield Bridge, keys still in the ignition, paperwork for his assigned inspection route scattered across the front seat as if he had been interrupted while reviewing his schedule. The investigating officer's notes, written in the careful handwriting of someone trained before typewriters became common, described a thorough search of the area around the bridge and the riverbank below. David's inspection equipment had been found neatly arranged in the truck bed, suggesting he had not yet begun his assigned tasks. His thermos, still half full of coffee, sat on the dashboard. His work boots bore no mud or debris that might indicate he had walked along the riverbank or through the adjacent woods. David's wife, Patricia Riley, had reported him missing when he failed to return home by 6 o'clock that evening. The couple had a standing arrangement for family dinner at 6:30, and David's punctuality was so reliable that Patricia began worrying within minutes of his expected arrival time. She had called his supervisor at the highway department, who confirmed that David had checked out his assigned route that morning and was expected to complete the inspection by mid-afternoon. The search for David continued for 2 weeks, involving volunteers from all the riverside communities and assistance from the state police. Boats dragged the river bottom near the bridge. Search dogs followed scent trails that ended abruptly at the water's edge. Helicopters surveyed the surrounding countryside from above. Local newspapers covered the search extensively, and David's photograph appeared in regional publications as far away as the state capital. But like Margaret Chun's disappearance in Millbrook years later, David Riley's case gradually moved from active investigation to cold file as leads were exhausted and the trail grew cold. Patricia Riley eventually moved away from the area, taking their children to live with her sister in another state. David's position at the highway department was filled by a new hire. The case file was archived with dozens of others in the courthouse basement, where it might have remained undisturbed if not for the plumbing leak that brought Martha Stevens into contact with its contents. The second file in the bundle concerned an incident that had occurred 18 months later, in September 1980, in the town of Cedar Point, approximately 15 miles downriver from where David Riley had disappeared. The case involved the discovery of a briefcase containing personal documents and a substantial amount of cash found by fishermen on the riverbank near the old railroad trestle that spanned the Clearwater at its narrowest point. The briefcase belonged to Robert Walsh, a traveling insurance salesman who had last been seen at the Cedar Point Motor Lodge on the evening of September 12, 1980. Robert had checked into the motel that afternoon, telling the desk clerk he planned to call on potential clients in the area for several days. His car, a blue Buick sedan with Ohio plates, remained in the motel parking lot for 3 days before the manager became concerned and contacted the local sheriff. Sheriff's deputies who searched Robert's motel room found his clothing neatly arranged in the dresser drawers, his toiletries organized on the bathroom counter, and his sample cases of insurance documents and promotional materials lined up beside the television. The bed appeared to have been slept in for only one night. There were no signs of struggle or disturbance, but Robert himself had seemingly vanished as completely as David Riley had vanished. Upstream and earlier, the discovery of Robert's briefcase, 2 weeks after his disappearance, raised more questions than it answered. The briefcase contained his personal identification, business cards, a checkbook, and nearly $3,000 in cash, an amount that suggested Robert had not been the victim of a simple robbery. The money was bound with rubber bands and stored in a manila envelope marked September Collections, indicating it represented payments from clients rather than personal funds. More puzzling was the briefcase's location. The railroad trestle where it was found stood nearly a mile from the Cedar Point Motor Lodge, connected by a winding dirt road that showed no tire tracks from Robert's Buick or any other vehicle. Briefcase showed signs of having been in the water for some time, but the current patterns of the Clearwater River made it impossible to determine where it had originally entered the water or how long it had been submerged before washing the shore. The third file in Martha Stevens' discovered bundle concerned events that had occurred in the summer of 1982 in the community of Riverton, the largest town along the Clearwater and the unofficial commercial center for the entire river valley. This case involved the disappearance of Emily Morrison, a librarian at the Riverton Public Library who had worked there for over 15 years and was known throughout the community for her involvement in local cultural activities. Emily Morrison was 54 years old, unmarried, and lived alone in a small apartment above the downtown drugstore. She walked to work each morning, arriving precisely at 8:30 to open the library for the day's patrons. Her evening routine was equally predictable. She would close the library at 6 o'clock, stop at Morrison's Market, no relation, despite the shared surname, for groceries, and return to her apartment by 7. On July 15, 1982, Emily failed to appear for work. The library remained locked when the first patrons arrived at 9 o'clock, and by 10:30, the town clerk had been contacted to investigate. Emily's apartment was found empty but undisturbed, with no signs that she had packed for travel or prepared for an extended absence. Her car, a 10-year-old Toyota that she drove only for longer errands, sat in its assigned parking space behind the apartment building. The investigation into Emily's disappearance was more extensive than those that had preceded it, perhaps because Riverton's larger size and political influence within the county warranted greater attention from law enforcement authorities. State police investigators interviewed dozens of library patrons, examined Emily's personal records and correspondence, and conducted searches along the riverbank and in the surrounding countryside. These investigations revealed that Emily had been researching local history as a personal project, focusing specifically on unsolved crimes and mysterious disappearances in the river valley. Her apartment contained notebooks filled with careful handwriting documenting cases that stretched back to the 1940s, including detailed notes about David Riley and Robert Walsh. She had been corresponding with retired law enforcement officers, newspaper reporters, and family members of missing persons, apparently seeking to identify patterns or connections that official investigations might have overlooked. Emily's research files, discovered in a locked drawer of her bedroom desk, contained photocopied police reports, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn maps showing the locations where various disappearances had occurred. She had created a timeline that stretched across 4 decades, marking each incident with colored pins on a large map of the river valley that covered one wall of her bedroom. The map showed a clear pattern of incidents clustering around certain locations along the Clearwater, particularly near bridges and other river crossings. Most significantly, Emily's notes revealed that she had planned to contact the state police about her findings. Her calendar for July 16th, the day after her disappearance, contained an appointment notation for a meeting with Detective Lieutenant Frank Morrison of the State Police Criminal Investigation Division. Emily had apparently believed her research had uncovered evidence of a pattern that warranted official attention. The bundling together of these 3 case files in the courthouse basement suggested that someone in law enforcement had recognized the connections that Emily Morrison had been investigating. Handwritten notes clipped to the files indicated they had been reviewed by Detective Lieutenant Morrison after Emily's disappearance, and that he had requested copies of all materials related to missing persons cases along the Clearwater River dating back to 1960. Detective Morrison's notes, written in a precise hand that reflected decades of police report writing, indicated his growing concern about the apparent pattern of disappearances. He had identified 7 separate incidents over a 22-year period, all involving individuals who had vanished without explanation. While traveling along or near the Clearwater River, the victims represented a cross-section of the local population, residents and visitors, men and women, different age groups and occupations. What united them was the complete absence of evidence about their fate and the recurring proximity to the river itself. Martha Stevens spent several days reading through the bundled files, her curiosity overcoming her usual focus on immediate administrative tasks. She began to understand why someone had grouped these cases together and why they had been kept separate from the routine filing system. The story they told, when examined collectively, suggested something far more troubling than isolated incidents of people choosing to disappear or falling victim to random misfortune. The more Martha learned about these cases, the more she began to notice connections that extended beyond the 3 files in her discovered bundle. Her familiarity with the courthouse's records allowed her to identify other missing persons cases that shared similar characteristics: unexplained absences, abandoned vehicles, personal belongings left undisturbed, and proximity to the Clearwater River. Each case had been investigated thoroughly within the limitations of its time and place, but none had been examined as part of a larger pattern. Working during lunch breaks and after hours, Martha began creating her own compilation of related cases. She discovered that Emily Morrison's research had been more extensive than even the state police files had indicated. Emily had identified connections between disappearances and certain recurring elements in the local landscape: specific bridges, boat launches, riverside picnic areas, and sections of highway that ran close to the water. The pattern that emerged from this research suggested that the Clearwater River Valley had been the site of far more mysterious disappearances than local residents realized. Individual communities along the river knew about incidents in their immediate area, but the broader pattern was visible only when cases from the entire valley were examined together. This fragmentation of knowledge had allowed a disturbing trend to continue largely unrecognized for decades. Martha's investigation also revealed how the decentralized nature of law enforcement in the river valley had complicated efforts to identify patterns. Different communities were served by different police departments, sheriff's offices, and state police barracks. Cases were investigated by whoever had jurisdiction, but there was limited communication between agencies about potentially related incidents. Emily Morrison, working as an independent researcher with access to public records, had been in a unique position to see connections that professional investigators had missed. As autumn settled over the river valley, Martha found herself spending more and more time reviewing cold case files and missing persons reports. Her supervisor, County Clerk Helen Bradley, initially worried that Martha was neglecting her regular duties, but gradually came to understand that Martha had uncovered something that warranted serious attention. The two women began working together to organize the scattered information into a comprehensive database that could be presented to current law enforcement officials. The database they created contained detailed information about 17 separate disappearances spanning 4 decades, all connected by their proximity to the Clearwater River and their shared characteristics of unexplained vanishing. The pattern was clear when viewed comprehensively, but it had remained largely invisible because each case had been investigated in isolation by different agencies at different times. Martha and Helen's work attracted the attention of Detective Sergeant Carol Hernandez, who had recently been assigned to the state police unit responsible for cold cases. Detective Hernandez was young enough to bring fresh perspective to old mysteries, but experienced enough to recognize the significance of the patterns Martha had documented. She requested permission to reopen several of the cases for modern review, using current investigative techniques and technology that had not been available during the original investigations. The riverside communities affected by these disappearances began to take notice as word of the research spread through informal networks of communication that connected small towns throughout the valley. Families who had lost relatives to unexplained disappearances found their old grief rekindled by the possibility that their individual tragedies might be connected to a larger pattern of criminal activity. In Cedar Point, Patricia Walsh, the widow of the insurance salesman whose briefcase had been found by the railroad trestle, returned to the area for the first time in years to meet with Detective Hernandez. Patricia had remarried and built a new life in a distant city, but the opportunity to finally understand her husband's fate drew her back to the river valley where she had once lived and worked. Similar reunions occurred in other communities, as families affected by the disappearances gathered to share information and support each other through the process of renewed investigation. These gatherings served both practical and emotional functions, allowing people to compare their experiences and contribute to the growing understanding of what had occurred along the Clearwater River over the decades. Asterisk. The Riverton Public Library, where Emily Morrison had worked, became an unofficial center for research into disappearances. Emily's successor as librarian, a young woman named Janet Pierce, dedicated significant library resources to maintaining and expanding Emily's research files. The library's local history collection grew to include materials related to all the missing persons cases, creating a resource that was available to both official investigators and family members seeking information about their lost relatives. As winter approached, the renewed attention to these cold cases began generating new leads and information. Residents who had been reluctant to share observations or suspicions decades earlier found new courage to speak with investigators. Technological advances in forensic analysis made it possible to re-examine physical evidence that had been preserved from the original investigations. Most significantly, the recognition that these cases were potentially connected opened new possibilities for understanding motives and methods that had remained hidden. When each case was considered in isolation, the Clearwater River continued its ancient flow toward the sea, carrying with it the accumulated sediments of countless seasons and the memories of communities that had grown up along its banks. But the river now carried something else as well, the weight of unanswered questions and the hope that patterns long hidden might finally be brought to light. In the courthouse basement, the files that Martha Stevens had discovered remained in their new organization, no longer forgotten remnants of bureaucratic archaeology, but active elements in an ongoing investigation. The leak that had prompted their discovery had been repaired, but the knowledge they contained continued to spread through the river valley like ripples spreading across still water, touching lives and communities in ways that would reshape understanding of the area's hidden history. The riverside communities learned to live with the knowledge that their peaceful valley had harbored mysteries far more complex than anyone had previously imagined. But they also learned that patience and persistence could bring hidden truths to light, and that the passage of time did not necessarily diminish the possibility of finding answers to questions that had seemed permanently unanswerable. Detective Hernandez continued her investigations throughout the winter months, traveling between communities along the river and building relationships with local residents who might hold pieces of the larger puzzle. Her work proceeded slowly and methodically, guided by the understanding that cases this old required careful attention to details that might easily be overlooked or dismissed. Files in the courthouse basement stood as testament to the power of careful record-keeping and the importance of preserving information that might seem insignificant at the time of its creation. They reminded everyone involved that justice and understanding could emerge from the most unexpected places, and that the dedication of individuals like Martha Stevens and Emily Morrison could illuminate truths that had remained hidden for decades. As the river valley settled into the quiet rhythms of winter, the communities along the Clearwater prepared for whatever revelations might emerge from the renewed investigations. They had learned to carry questions without easy answers, but they had also learned that questions persistently asked could eventually find their way toward resolution, flowing like the river itself toward destinations that might be distant, but were not necessarily unreachable. The village of Saltwind Cove sits where the land meets the endless ocean, its weathered houses clustered around a natural harbor that has sheltered fishing boats for over 2 centuries. The lighthouse that guards the harbor entrance still operates, though its beam now sweeps across waters traveled more by recreational sailors than working fishermen. In the early morning hours, when fog rolls in from the Atlantic and muffles all sound except the steady rhythm of waves against stone, the village feels suspended between the present day and memories that stretch back through generations of maritime life. It was in this timeless atmosphere, where past and present blend like fog and salt air, that the story of vanished souls began to emerge through fragments of memory and whispered family histories. Unlike the documented cases that filled courthouse files in riverside counties, the mysteries of Saltwind Cove lived primarily in oral tradition, passed down through families who had worked these waters for generations and learned to keep certain knowledge close to their hearts. Brennan family had operated the village's only inn for nearly a century, welcoming travelers who arrived by coastal highway or visiting yacht owners who needed comfortable accommodations while their vessels rested in the protected harbor. The inn occupied a Victorian mansion that had been built by a shipping merchant in the 1890s, its wraparound porches and widow's walk offering commanding views of both the harbor and the open ocean. Beyond, Moira Brennan had inherited the inn from her grandmother 15 years earlier, along with the responsibility of maintaining family traditions that extended far beyond simple hospitality. The inn's guest registers, dating back to 1924, contained signatures and stories from thousands of visitors, but they also contained gaps and mysteries that reflected the darker currents that occasionally disturbed Saltwind Cove's peaceful facade. Asterisk. Among the inn's most treasured possessions was a collection of leather-bound journals that previous generations of Brennans had maintained, recording not just the business details of inn operations, but also the informal history of the village and its residents. These journals contained accounts of storms that had claimed fishing boats, celebrations that had marked successful seasons, and the gradual changes that had transformed Saltwind Cove from a working fishing village into a quiet retreat favored by artists and summer visitors. But the journals also contained more troubling entries, carefully worded accounts of visitors who had arrived at the inn and then disappeared without explanation, leaving behind personal belongings and unpaid bills, but no clues about their intended destinations or reasons for leaving. These disappearances were recorded in the same matter-of-fact style used for weather reports and supply deliveries, as if unexplained vanishings were simply another aspect of coastal life that required documentation, but not necessarily explanation. Earliest recorded disappearance dated to the summer of 1931, when a traveling photographer named William Ashford had arrived at the inn with several cases of expensive camera equipment and plans to document what he called the authentic maritime culture of the Maine coast. William had checked into room 7, a corner room with windows facing both the harbor and the ocean, and had spent several days photographing the fishing boats, harbor facilities, and village buildings. According to Moira's great-grandmother's journal entries, William had been an enthusiastic guest who rose early to capture the morning light and stayed out late photographing sunset scenes from various vantage points around the village. He had spoken with local fishermen about their work and traditions, requesting permission to photograph them at their daily tasks. His evident respect for the community and its ways had earned him acceptance from residents who were often wary of outsiders seeking to document their lives. On July 15, 1931, William had left the inn after breakfast, carrying his camera equipment and mentioning plans to hike along the coastal trail that connected Saltwind Cove with neighboring villages. He had asked about the timing of high and low tides, explaining that he wanted to photograph the rocky coastline during different water conditions. The inn's desk clerk had provided him with a tide chart and warned him about sections of the trail that became dangerous during high tide. William Ashford never returned to the inn. His camera cases were found 3 days later by local fishermen, arranged neatly on a flat granite ledge, overlooking a particularly scenic stretch of coastline about 2 miles north of the village. The cameras themselves were missing, but the cases contained exposed film, spare lenses, and other equipment that would have been valuable to any casual thief. There was no sign of struggle or accident, no indication that William had fallen from the cliffs or been swept away by an unexpected wave. The local constable, a practical man named Thomas Kelly, who had lived in Saltwind Cove his entire life, conducted a thorough investigation within the limitations of rural law enforcement in 1931. He interviewed the fishermen who had discovered William's equipment, examined the clifftop location where the cases had been found, and organized search parties that combed miles of coastline looking for additional clues. Constable Kelly's report, preserved in the town hall's archives, noted that William's missing cameras represented significant financial value and would have been difficult for him to carry if he had decided to leave the area voluntarily. The report also documented interviews with several village residents who had seen William on the morning of his disappearance, all of whom described him as appearing normal and enthusiastic about his planned photographic expedition. The mystery of William Ashford's fate became part of Saltwind Cove's oral history, discussed in fish-in boat conversations and remembered during winter evenings when families gathered around fireplaces and shared stories of the village's past. But William's disappearance was not an isolated incident, and the Brennan family journals recorded similar events that occurred with disturbing regularity over the subsequent decades. In September 1947, a marine biology student named Catherine Mayer had disappeared while conducting research on tidal pool ecosystems for her graduate thesis. Catherine had been staying at the inn for 3 weeks, making daily expeditions to various points along the rocky coastline to collect specimens and document the diverse life forms that flourished in the intertidal zones. Her research notebooks, found abandoned on the rocks near Gull Point, contained detailed observations and sketches that demonstrated her deep knowledge and genuine passion for marine science. Catherine's disappearance occurred during a period of unusually calm weather, with no storms or dangerous surf conditions that might have contributed to an accidental drowning. Her research equipment, microscopes, specimen containers, and reference books remained in her room at the inn, suggesting she had not planned to leave permanently. Local residents organized extensive search parties, and the Coast Guard conducted aerial and marine searches that covered miles of coastline and open ocean. Investigation into Catherine's disappearance was more thorough than the inquiry into William Ashford's fate 16 years earlier, reflecting improvements in law enforcement capabilities and increased attention from state authorities. But despite these advances, investigators found no evidence that explained Catherine's vanishing any more clearly than the earlier case. The Brennan family journals recorded these disappearances alongside the routine events of inn operations, creating a historical record that revealed patterns invisible to casual observation. Moira's grandmother had begun noting correlations between the disappearances and certain environmental conditions. Most occurred during periods of unusual calm when the ocean appeared particularly peaceful and inviting. Many involved visitors who had developed strong connections to the local landscape and expressed reluctance to leave. When their planned stays concluded, these patterns became more apparent as additional cases accumulated over the years. In 1956, a retired naval officer named James Patterson had vanished while painting watercolor landscapes along the coastal cliffs. In 1963, a folk music researcher named Dorothy Walsh had disappeared while recording traditional sea songs performed by elderly village residents. In 1971, an amateur historian named Robert Sterling had vanished while researching shipwrecks that had occurred along the treacherous stretch of coast north of the village. Each disappearance shared similar characteristics: visitors who had developed deep appreciation for Saltwind Cove's natural beauty and cultural heritage, who had expressed strong emotional connections to the area, and who had vanished without explanation while engaged in solitary activities along the coastline. Personal belongings were typically found arranged in orderly fashion, with no signs of struggle or accident, suggesting that whatever had occurred had not involved violence or panic. That the cumulative effect of these mysteries on Saltwind Cove's residents was subtle but profound. Families who had lived in the village for generations developed an intuitive understanding of which visitors might be at risk, though they rarely articulated this knowledge directly. They learned to pay closer attention to guests who seemed too enchanted by the ocean's beauty, who spoke of feeling called by the sea, or who expressed reluctance to return to their previous lives after experiencing the village's timeless atmosphere. This protective instinct manifested in gentle interventions: fishermen who would offer to accompany solitary visitors on coastal hikes, inn staff who would suggest alternative activities for guests who seemed drawn to dangerous clifftop areas during certain weather conditions, and local artists who would invite particularly susceptible visitors to join group activities rather than pursuing their interests alone. The village's unofficial network of protection operated through subtle communication and shared understanding rather than formal organization. Long-term residents had developed the ability to recognize warning signs that outsiders might dismiss as romantic nonsense. The way certain visitors would stare at the ocean with unusual intensity, their tendency to spend hours sitting alone on rocky promontories, their expressions of feeling more at home near the water than they had ever felt in their previous lives. Dr. Margaret Foster, who had served as the village's only physician for over 30 years, had observed psychological patterns among visitors that seemed to correlate with the disappearances. In her private notes, she documented cases of individuals who reported unusually vivid dreams about the ocean, who claimed to hear voices or music emanating from the water, and who described feeling drawn to specific locations along the coastline with an intensity that seemed beyond normal tourist enthusiasm. Observations led Dr. Foster to develop her own informal theory about the disappearances, though she was careful not to share her speculations with anyone outside the close-knit community of village residents. She believed that certain individuals possessed psychological predispositions that made them particularly susceptible to what she privately termed oceanic displacement syndrome, a condition in which the vast, hypnotic presence of the sea could trigger dissociative episodes in vulnerable personalities. Dr. Foster's theory was supported by her observation that the missing individuals had typically been creative, introspective people who were experiencing transitions or uncertainties in their lives. They had come to Saltwind Cove seeking inspiration, solitude, or escape from personal problems, and they had found themselves overwhelmed by the ocean's psychological power in ways that their rational minds could not process or resist. Villages' fishing families possessed their own explanations for the disappearances, rooted in maritime traditions that stretched back centuries and acknowledged forces that scientific minds might dismiss as superstition. Old fishermen spoke of certain areas along the coast where the water behaved differently, where currents created unusual patterns and tidal actions seemed to follow rules that contradicted normal oceanographic principles. These families had learned through generations of experience to avoid fishing in certain areas during specific weather conditions, not because of documented dangers but because of accumulated wisdom that warned against challenging forces they did not fully understand. Their knowledge was practical rather than theoretical, based on observations of weather patterns, water behavior, and the subtle signs that experienced mariners used to navigate safely in dangerous waters. The lighthouse keeper, whose family had maintained the beacon for 4 generations, possessed perhaps the most comprehensive understanding of the coastal mysteries. From his elevated vantage point, he had observed patterns in the ocean's behavior that were invisible from ground level. The way fog formations moved in seemingly impossible directions during certain atmospheric conditions, the appearance of unusual phosphorescence in the water that seemed to follow regular cycles unrelated to known marine phenomena. The lighthouse logbooks, maintained continuously since 1887, contained careful records of weather conditions, ship movements, and unusual phenomena observed from the lighthouse platform. These records revealed correlations between the disappearances and specific environmental conditions, atmospheric pressure readings that fell outside normal ranges, wind patterns that contradicted established weather systems, and ocean surface conditions that experienced mariners found difficult to explain. As Moira Brennan continued maintaining her family's inn and its associated traditions, she found herself serving as an informal guardian of knowledge that few outsiders could fully comprehend. The inn's guest registers and family journals represented a historical archive that documented not just the disappearances themselves but also the community's evolving response to mysteries that seemed to be woven into the very fabric of coastal Life. This responsibility required delicate balance between preserving historical truth and protecting both visitors and residents from knowledge that might prove more disturbing than helpful. Moira learned to recognize the warning signs that previous generations had identified, and she developed her own methods for protecting susceptible guests without alarming them or destroying their appreciation for Saltwind Cove's natural beauty. The village's response to these ongoing mysteries demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of communities that had learned to coexist with forces beyond their complete understanding or control. Rather than allowing fear to dominate their relationship with the ocean that provided both their livelihood and their greatest source of mystery, they had developed practical wisdom that acknowledged danger while preserving their deep connection to the maritime environment that defined their identity. Local artists who had settled in Saltwind Cove found inspiration in the village's mysterious atmosphere, creating paintings, sculptures, and literary works that captured both the beauty and the underlying tension that characterized life on this particular stretch of coast. Their work attracted other creative individuals to the village, maintaining the cycle of visitors who came seeking artistic inspiration and sometimes found more than they had bargained for. The village's small gallery, housed in a converted fish processing building near the harbor, displayed works that reflected the complex emotional landscape of coastal life. Paintings captured the ocean in its various moods, from serene dawn scenes to stone-lashed cliffs, while sculptures incorporated materials found along the beach, driftwood shaped by years of wave action, stones polished by countless tides, shells and sea glass that had been transformed by their journey through the marine environment. These artistic interpretations of coastal life served multiple functions within the village community. They provided economic benefits by attracting tourists and art buyers, but they also served as a means of processing and expressing the complex emotions that arose from living in a place where beauty and mystery coexisted in perpetual tension. The seasonal rhythms of coastal life helped village residents maintain perspective on the disappearances and their ongoing impact on community consciousness. Summer brought crowds of visitors, busy harbor activity, and the cheerful chaos of tourist season that temporarily pushed darker concerns into the background. Winter brought isolation, introspection, and the opportunity for long-term residents to reconnect with the deeper currents of village life. During winter months, when the tourist season ended and the village population contracted to its core of year-round residents, the mysteries seemed to recede without disappearing entirely. The ocean remained present and powerful, but its psychological impact was filtered through the practical concerns of maintaining heat, securing boats against winter storms, and preparing for the harsh weather that tested coastal communities each year. These seasonal cycles reminded residents that the disappearances, however mysterious, represented only one aspect of their complex relationship with the marine environment that shaped every aspect of their lives. The ocean provided their economic foundation through fishing and tourism, their aesthetic inspiration through its ever-changing beauty, and their spiritual connection to forces larger than individual human concerns. As autumn settled over Saltwind Cove, bringing shorter days and the first hints of winter weather, the village prepared for another season of quiet reflection and renewed attention to the mysteries that had shaped its identity for generations. The lighthouse beam continued its nightly sweep across waters that held secrets perhaps deeper than the ocean floor itself, marking safe passage for some while serving as a memorial to others whose journeys had ended in ways that might never be fully understood. The inn's guest registers remained open to new signatures and new stories, each entry representing another thread in the ongoing tapestry of human experience that connected past and present, known and unknown, explicable and mysterious. And in that ongoing story, the village of Saltwind Cove continued to serve as a place where the boundaries between reality and mystery remained as fluid and ever-changing as the tides themselves. Asterisk. The Meridian and Northern Railroad once connected a dozen small towns across 3 counties, carrying passengers and freight along a route that wound through forests, farmland, and river valleys in the heart of rural America. The line operated for nearly 8 decades, from 1892 until 1969, when declining ridership and competition from interstate highways finally forced its abandonment. Today, the tracks have been removed from most sections, leaving behind only the raised roadbed and the occasional bridge or tunnel to mark where trains once traveled between communities that now seem more isolated than they did when connected by the regular rhythm of scheduled service. The abandoned stations that once served as focal points for commerce and communication stand as monuments to a vanished way of life. Some have been converted to other uses: restaurants, antique shops, private residences, while others remain empty, their Victorian architecture slowly surrendering to weather and neglect. But in the quiet spaces between these visible remnants of railroad history, other traces remain hidden, waiting for discovery by those who know where to look and what questions to ask. Detective Ray Martinez of the State Police had spent most of his 30-year career investigating crimes that occurred along active transportation corridors, highway accidents, truck hijackings, murders at rest stops and truck terminals. When budget cuts forced his reassignment to the cold case unit, he initially viewed it as an unwelcome transition to work that seemed less urgent and less likely to produce satisfying results. Martinez's methodical approach to investigation and his deep knowledge of transportation systems proved unexpectedly valuable in examining cases that had remained unsolved for decades. His first assignment involved reviewing files related to missing persons along the defunct Meridian and Northern route, a task that seemed straightforward until he began mapping the locations where various disappearances had occurred over the railroad's operational lifetime. The pattern that emerged was subtle but unmistakable. Between 1923 and 1968, 17 individuals had vanished while traveling to, from, or near stations along the Meridian and Northern Line. The disappearances had been investigated by different law enforcement agencies in different jurisdictions at different times, preventing anyone from recognizing the connections until Martinez began plotting them on a comprehensive map of the railroad's route. The first documented case dated to March 1923, when a traveling salesman named Arthur Wickham had disappeared while waiting for the evening train at Brookdale Station. Arthur had been selling farm implements to rural customers throughout the region, traveling by train from town to town with sample cases and order forms for equipment that local dealers could not stock. His business required precise timing and reliable transportation, making him a regular passenger on trains that served the agricultural communities along the Meridian and Northern route. According to station agent records preserved in the railroad company's archives, Arthur had arrived at Brookdale Station that afternoon, carrying his usual complement of sample cases, and had purchased a ticket for the 8:15 evening departure to Millerton, where he planned to call on potential customers the following day. The station agent remembered Arthur as a courteous, punctual passenger who had made similar trips on numerous previous occasions. The evening train arrived at Brookdale Station precisely on schedule, but Arthur Wickham was not among the passengers who boarded. His sample cases were found neatly arranged on a bench in the station's waiting room, apparently positioned for easy carrying when the train arrived. His ticket remained in his coat pocket, and his luggage showed no signs of hasty departure or struggle. The station agent, concerned about Arthur's absence, delayed the train's departure for 15 minutes while conducting a brief search of the station platform and surrounding area. But with no sign of the missing passenger and other travelers waiting to continue their journeys, the train eventually departed on a revised schedule, leaving behind only Arthur's sample cases and unanswered questions about his fate. Local authorities investigated Arthur's disappearance within the limited capabilities available to rural law enforcement in 1923. They interviewed other passengers who had been waiting for the same train, examined the contents of Arthur's sample cases for clues about his business activities and personal circumstances, and searched the area around Brookdale Station for evidence of accident or foul play. Asterisk. The investigation revealed that Arthur had been experiencing financial difficulties related to declining sales and increasing competition from larger companies with more efficient distribution systems. His sample cases contained unpaid bills and correspondence with creditors who were pressuring him for payment on overdue accounts. This evidence suggested the possibility that Arthur had deliberately disappeared to escape his mounting debts, but it did not explain why he had left behind merchandise and order forms that represented his primary means of earning income. As Martinez reviewed the case files decades later, he noted details that might not have seemed significant to investigators in 1923, but took on greater meaning when viewed in conjunction with similar disappearances. Arthur's sample cases had been arranged with unusual precision, far more carefully than would be expected from someone abandoning his possessions in haste or despair. The positioning suggested deliberate placement by someone who wanted the cases to be easily discovered rather than hidden or discarded. Martinez also observed that Brookdale Station occupied a particularly isolated location along the railroad route, situated in a rural valley several miles from the nearest settlement. The station served primarily as a flagstop for passengers traveling to larger towns, and during evening hours it was typically deserted except for waiting passengers on the station agent who managed ticket sales and freight operations. The second case in Martinez's files involved the disappearance of Helen Morrison, a young woman who had vanished while traveling from her family's farm to a teaching position in the county seat. Helen's disappearance occurred in September 1931, during the early years of the Great Depression, when economic hardship was forcing many rural families to seek opportunities in more prosperous areas. Asterisk. Helen had completed her teacher training during the previous summer and had accepted a position at Millerton Elementary School, where she was to begin work at the start of the autumn term. Her family's farm was located near Greenwood Station, approximately halfway along the Meridian and Northern Route, and Helen had planned to travel by train to Millerton, where she would board with a local family during the school year. On September 8, 1931, Helen's father had driven her to Greenwood Station in the family's Model T Ford, arriving well before the scheduled departure of the 2:30 afternoon train. Helen carried a single suitcase containing clothing and personal items, along with a smaller bag holding books and teaching materials she had accumulated during her training program. The station agent at Greenwood, a man named Thomas Reed who had worked for the railroad for over 15 years, remembered Helen's arrival and her purchase of a one-way ticket to Millerton. He had engaged her in brief conversation about her teaching assignment and had wished her success in her new position. Helen had seemed nervous but excited about the opportunities that awaited her in town. When the afternoon train arrived at Greenwood Station, Helen Morrison was not among the passengers who boarded. Her suitcase and book bag were found sitting beside the track, positioned neatly on the wooden platform, as if she had set them down temporarily and then forgotten to retrieve them. Station Agent Reed conducted a thorough search of the station building and surrounding area but found no trace of Helen herself. The investigation into Helen's disappearance was more extensive than the inquiry into Arthur Wickham's fate 8 years earlier, reflecting both improved law enforcement capabilities and the greater community concern that surrounded the disappearance of a young woman from a respected farming family. State police investigators interviewed Helen's family, friends, and teacher training classmates, seeking evidence of personal problems or relationship complications that might explain her vanishing. These interviews revealed that Helen had been uncertain about leaving her family's farm for a teaching position in town, but her doubts appeared to stem from normal anxiety about starting a new job, rather than serious reservations about her chosen career path. She had no known romantic entanglements that might have complicated her departure, and her family relationships were stable and supportive. Most puzzling was the condition in which Helen's luggage had been found. Like Arthur Wickham's sample cases, Helen's belongings had been arranged with careful precision that suggested deliberate placement rather than hasty abandonment. Her suitcase was closed and latched properly, and her book bag was positioned upright beside it, giving the impression that she had intended to return momentarily to collect her possessions. Martinez's review of these cases, decades later, revealed additional patterns that had not been apparent to investigators at the time of the original incidents. Both disappearances had occurred at small, isolated stations during periods when passenger traffic was light and observation by potential witnesses was minimal. Both missing persons had been traveling alone and carrying possessions that would have been valuable to thieves but were left undisturbed at the scene. More significantly, both cases had occurred during periods of economic uncertainty when many people were experiencing financial stress and considering major life changes. This context might have provided cover for voluntary disappearances, but it did not explain the precise arrangement of abandoned possessions or the complete absence of any subsequent contact with family or friends. The third case in Martinez's files involved the 1940 disappearance of Robert Sterling, a railroad inspector whose job required him to travel regularly along the Meridian and Northern route, examining track conditions, signal equipment, and station facilities. Robert's work brought him into contact with railroad employees throughout the system, and his familiarity with train schedules and operating procedures made him an unlikely candidate for substitution. Accidental mishap while traveling. Robert had been conducting routine inspections along the northern section of the route, checking signal equipment and examining track conditions following a period of heavy rain that had caused minor washouts in several locations. His inspection schedule called for him to examine facilities at 4 different stations over a 2-day period, documenting any maintenance needs and filing reports with the railroad's engineering department. On November 10, 1940, Robert failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with the section foreman at Oakville Station, where they planned to discuss repairs needed to a damaged culvert that affected drainage near the tracks. Robert's inspection handcar was found parked beside the tracks approximately 2 miles south of the station, positioned properly on a siding and secured with the standard safety procedures required by railroad regulations. Robert's inspection equipment, measuring tools, signal testing devices, and maintenance manuals remained in the handcar, organized according to the systematic methods he had developed during his 15-year career with the railroad. His clipboard contained partially completed inspection reports, documenting conditions at stations he had examined earlier in his scheduled route, with notations that reflected his characteristic attention to detail and technical precision. Investigation into Robert's disappearance was conducted primarily by railroad security personnel, who possessed specialized knowledge of operational procedures and safety requirements that local law enforcement might not have fully understood. Railroad investigators interviewed section crews, station agents, and other employees who might have encountered Robert during his inspection tour, seeking information about his activities and state of mind. Asterisk. These interviews revealed that Robert had been concerned about increasing maintenance backlogs that resulted from budget constraints imposed by the railroad's declining financial condition. He had mentioned to several colleagues his frustration with postponed repairs and deferred maintenance that he believed compromised operational safety. But his concerns appeared to be professional rather than personal, and there was no indication that he was considering leaving his job or abandoning his responsibilities. The positive elms, abandoning his responsibilities. Location where Robert's handcar was discovered presented additional puzzles that investigators found difficult to resolve. The sighting where the handcar was parked was located in a remote section of the route, several miles from the nearest road or settlement, making it an unlikely location for someone seeking transportation away from the area. The handcar itself showed no signs of mechanical problems that might have stranded Robert in the remote location. Martinez's analysis of these 3 cases, conducted with the benefit of decades of investigative experience and access to comprehensive files from multiple jurisdictions, revealed connections that had not been visible to the original investigators. All 3 disappearances had occurred at isolated locations along the railroad route during periods when normal traffic was minimal and potential witnesses were scarce. More significantly, all 3 cases involved individuals whose work or travel brought them into regular contact with railroad operations and personnel, suggesting they possessed knowledge about train schedules, operational procedures, and the geography of the route that might have been relevant to their disappearances. This pattern suggested that the missing persons might have been targeted specifically because of their familiarity with railroad operations rather than chosen randomly. Martinez's investigation expanded to include cases that had occurred during the later years of the railroad's operation, as changing economic conditions and declining passenger service created different circumstances, but similar patterns of mysterious disappearances. The files contained accounts of 6 additional vanishings that had occurred between 1950 and 1968, each sharing characteristics that linked them to the earlier cases. These later disappearances included Sarah Chun, a postal clerk who had vanished while sorting mail on a train traveling between Millerton and Brookdale in 1954. Frank Morrison, a railroad photographer documenting facilities along the route, who disappeared near Greenwood Station in 1961. And Dorothy Walsh, a railroad historian researching the line's operational history, who vanished during a field trip to abandoned stations in 1967. Each of these cases had been investigated by appropriate authorities at the time of occurrence, but the investigations had been hampered by jurisdictional complications, limited resources, and the assumption that most disappearances along transportation corridors involved voluntary departures by people seeking to escape personal or financial problems. Martinez's comprehensive review revealed that the missing persons represented a cross-section of individuals whose lives had been connected to railroad operations in various capacities: employees, regular passengers, researchers, and others whose work or interests brought them into contact with the Meridian and Northern system. This connection suggested that their disappearances might have been related to specific knowledge they possessed about railroad operations, historical events, or ongoing activities that someone wanted to keep hidden. The detective's investigation also uncovered evidence that several of the missing persons had been asking questions about unusual activities they had observed along the railroad route. Frank Morrison's photography notes contained references to freight cars that appeared to be traveling on irregular schedules. Sarah Chun had mentioned suspicious mail deliveries to colleagues, and Dorothy Walsh's research had focused on discrepancies in official records about the railroad's financial operations. These observations suggested that the disappearances might have been connected to illegal activities that had used the railroad as a transportation corridor for smuggling operations, organized crime, or other criminal enterprises that required the cover of legitimate business operations. The isolated nature of much of the route, combined with limited law enforcement presence in rural areas, would have made the railroad an attractive option for criminals seeking to move contraband or conduct illegal business away from populated areas. As Martinez continued his investigation, he began to understand that the abandoned railroad represented not just a vanished transportation system, but also a complex network of relationships, operations, and secrets that had been buried along with the tracks themselves. The missing persons cases were like archaeological artifacts that revealed glimpses of hidden activities that had flourished in the shadows of legitimate railroad operations. The detectives' work attracted attention from federal agencies that had been investigating historical cases of organized crime, smuggling operations, and other illegal activities that had used transportation networks during the mid-20th century. These agencies possessed files and intelligence reports that complemented Martinez's missing persons cases, creating a more comprehensive picture of criminal activities that had operated along the Meridian and Northern route. The collaboration between Martinez and federal investigators revealed that the railroad had been used extensively for illegal alcohol transportation during Prohibition, and that these smuggling networks had evolved after repeal to handle other contraband including drugs, stolen goods, and black market merchandise during World War II and the post-war period. Missing persons appeared to have been individuals who had discovered evidence of these illegal operations through their legitimate work or research activities. Their disappearances served to protect criminal enterprises that generated substantial profits and involved individuals with the resources and motivation to eliminate potential witnesses or investigators. This understanding provided explanations for the precise arrangement of abandoned possessions at disappearance scenes, the selection of isolated locations with minimal witness presence, and the complete absence of subsequent contact by missing persons with family or friends. The disappearances had been carefully planned. Operations designed to remove individuals who posed threats to ongoing criminal activities. Martinez's investigation into the abandoned railroad route continued throughout the winter months as he traced connections between historical criminal activities and the pattern of disappearances that had occurred over nearly 5 decades of railroad operations. His work revealed that transportation corridors like the Meridian and Northern had served multiple functions simultaneously. Legitimate business operations that provided cover for illegal activities, isolated locations where criminal meetings could occur without detection, and transportation networks that connected criminal enterprises across multiple jurisdictions. The abandoned stations along the route stood as monuments not only to the decline of passenger rail service but also to the complex criminal enterprises that had once flourished in the spaces between legitimate commerce and law enforcement attention. The missing persons cases represented the human cost of criminal operations that had valued secrecy above human life and had eliminated anyone who threatened to expose their activities. As spring returned to the rural counties where the Meridian and Northern had once operated, Martinez prepared comprehensive reports that documented his findings and provided closure for families who had lost relatives to unexplained disappearances decades earlier. His investigation had revealed that the abandoned railroad route contained secrets far more sinister than simple transportation history, and that the missing persons had been victims of criminal enterprises that had exploited the isolation and limited oversight that characterized rural transportation networks during much of the 20th century. The detectives' work served as a reminder that transportation corridors had always been more than simply routes for legitimate travel and commerce, and that the shadows cast by abandoned infrastructure often concealed stories of human tragedy and criminal enterprise that demanded investigation and remembrance long after the trains had stopped running and the tracks had been removed from the landscape they had once connected. Thornfield Manor sits on a hillside overlooking the Blackwater Valley, its Gothic Revival architecture casting long shadows across terraced gardens that have grown wild with decades of minimal care. The mansion was built in 1889 by textile magnate Harrison Blackwood, whose fortune was founded on mills that processed cotton shipped north from southern plantations in the years following the Civil War. For 3 generations, the Blackwood family occupied the manor, hosting elaborate social gatherings that drew prominent visitors from across the region and maintaining extensive grounds that employed dozens of gardeners, groundskeepers, and domestic staff. The mansion's 47 rooms contained furniture and artwork collected during family travels to Europe, along with portraits of ancestors whose stern expressions seemed to follow observers through the high-ceilinged halls. The library held over 8,000 volumes, including first editions and rare manuscripts that reflected the family's scholarly interests and their desire to establish cultural credentials commensurate with their industrial wealth. The ballroom featured crystal chandeliers imported from Austria and hardwood floors designed to accommodate formal dances that attracted society figures from throughout the state. But beneath the manor's impressive facade lay family secrets that had accumulated like dust in unused rooms, growing darker and more complex with each generation that inherited both the Blackwood fortune and the responsibilities that came with preserving the family's reputation and social position. These secrets remained hidden within the mansion's walls for decades, known only to family members who had learned to keep certain knowledge private and to household staff who understood that discretion was a condition of continued employment. The first whispers of trouble within the Blackwood family began in the late 1920s, when Harrison's grandson Charles returned from his European grand tour with interests and associations that his father considered unsuitable for someone of his social position. Charles had developed fascinations with modern art, radical politics, and unconventional social philosophies that put him at odds with the conservative values that had guided the Blackwood family through 3 generations of business success. Charles's father, Harrison Blackwood Jr., had assumed leadership of the family textile business following his father's death in 1923, and he viewed his son's new interests as threats to both the family's commercial enterprises and their social standing within the conservative community that formed their primary customer base. The conflicts between father and son played out increasingly bitter arguments that echoed through Thornfield Manor's halls and created tensions that affected every aspect of household operations. These family disputes might have remained private matters if not for Charles's romantic involvement with Elena Vasquez, a Spanish artist whose political views and bohemian lifestyle scandalized the local society circles where the Blackwood family had long held prominent positions. Elena had arrived in the United States as a refugee from the Spanish Civil War, carrying with her artistic talents, radical ideas, and a personal history that included associations with communist organizers and anarchist philosophers. Charles met Elena in New York City during one of his frequent trips to galleries and museums, and he was immediately captivated by both her artistic abilities and her passionate commitment to social justice causes that challenged the economic foundations of families like his own. Their relationship developed rapidly, despite Harrison Jr.'s strong objections and his threats to disinherit Charles if he continued associating with someone whose political views were so contrary to family interests. The situation reached a crisis point in the spring of 1938 when Charles announced his intention to marry Elena and to use his inheritance to support artistic and political causes that she championed. Harrison Jr. responded by threatening to revise his will to exclude Charles entirely, while Charles countered by threatening to expose family business practices that he claimed violated labor laws and exploited vulnerable workers in ways that contradicted the Christian values the family publicly embraced. Elena Vasquez arrived at Thornfield Manor in June 1938, ostensibly for a brief visit that would allow her to meet Charles's family and perhaps find common ground with his father despite their political differences. She brought with her several paintings that demonstrated her considerable artistic talents, along with a passionate commitment to social causes that put her at immediate odds with the conservative household staff and the traditional values that governed daily life at the manor. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, had worked for the Blackwood family for over 20 years and had developed fierce loyalty to their interests and traditions. Mrs. Patterson viewed Elena's presence as a threat to the stability and respectability that had always characterized Thornfield Manor, and she made little effort to conceal her disapproval of the young woman's unconventional ideas and casual disregard for social protocols that Mrs. Patterson considered essential to proper household management. Elena's visit was planned to last 2 weeks, during which she would stay in the Blue Room, a guest suite that had previously accommodated visiting business associates and family friends who shared the Blackwood family's social and political perspectives. The room featured antique furniture, oil paintings depicting pastoral scenes, and windows that offered views of the formal gardens where Elena hoped to find inspiration for new artistic works. Elena's stay at Thornfield Manor was destined to last far longer than anyone had anticipated, though not in the manner that Charles or his father had expected when they reluctantly agreed to her visit. On the morning of June 23, 1938, Elena failed to appear for breakfast, an absence that initially seemed unremarkable given her habit of rising late and her general disregard for the structured meal times that regulated life at the manor. Mrs. Patterson knocked on Elena's door at mid-morning, concerned that the young woman might have taken ill during the night. When there was no response, the housekeeper used her master key to enter the Blue Room, where she found the bed undisturbed, and Elena's belongings arranged as if she had planned to return momentarily. Elena's easel stood near the window with a half-finished painting of the garden. Her brushes were cleaned and organized on a nearby table, and her suitcase remained unpacked in the wardrobe. A thorough search of Thornfield Manor revealed no trace of Elena's whereabouts. The mansion's numerous rooms, basement storage areas, and servant quarters were examined systematically, but Elena seemed to have vanished as completely as if she had never arrived at all. The only clues to her presence were her personal belongings in the Blue Room and the unfinished painting that captured the garden in the particular light of late afternoon. Charles was devastated by Elena's disappearance and immediately suspected that his obvious father had arranged for her removal from the manor through methods that he preferred not to investigate too closely. Harrison Jr. denied any involvement in Elena's vanishing, but his obvious relief at her absence created suspicions that poisoned the already strained relationship between father and son. The local sheriff, a practical man named Robert Hayes, whose jurisdiction included the rural area surrounding Thornfield Manor, conducted an investigation that was thorough within the limitations of rural law enforcement in 1938. Sheriff Hayes interviewed all members of the household staff, examined the grounds surrounding the manor, and contacted law enforcement agencies in neighboring counties to determine whether Elena might have left the area voluntarily. The investigation revealed no evidence of violence or struggle in Elena's room or anywhere else within the manor. Her belongings showed no signs of hasty packing or departure, and several valuable items, jewelry, art supplies, and a camera that Charles had given her remained undisturbed among her possessions. Most puzzling was the unfinished painting on her easel, which depicted the garden view from her window with precise attention to details that suggested she had been working on it shortly before her disappearance. Mrs. Patterson, when questioned by Sheriff Hayes, provided testimony that was factually accurate, but colored by her obvious disapproval of Elena and her relief that the young woman was no longer disrupting the household routines that Mrs. Patterson had spent decades perfecting. The housekeeper mentioned Elena's habit of taking solitary walks through the gardens and her tendency to sketch in locations that were not easily observed from the manor's windows. Other household staff, members, gardeners, kitchen workers, and cleaning staff provided similar accounts of Elena's activities during her brief stay at Thornfield Manor. They described her as polite but distant, engaged with her artistic work, but uninterested in the social interactions that normally characterized guest visits. Several mentioned her frequent questions about the manor's history and her particular interest in family photographs and portraits that decorated the halls and public rooms. As weeks passed without any trace of Elena's whereabouts, Charles became increasingly convinced that his father had arranged for her removal through criminal means that amounted to kidnapping or worse. Harrison Jr. continued to deny any involvement, but his refusal to hire private investigators or offer rewards for information about Elena's fate suggested to Charles that his father possessed knowledge about her disappearance that he was not willing to share. The conflict between father and son intensified throughout the summer and autumn of 1938, creating an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and hostility that affected every aspect of life at Thornfield Manor. Household staff found themselves caught between competing loyalties and conflicting demands as Charles and his father each sought allies in their ongoing battle over Elena's fate and the broader issues of family values and social responsibility that her disappearance had brought to a crisis point. The psychological impact of Elena's vanishing extended beyond the immediate family to affect the household staff who had witnessed the mounting tensions between Charles and his father. Mrs. Patterson found herself struggling to maintain the orderly routines that had always governed life at the manor, as the conflict between the two men created uncertainties about authority, decision-making, and the basic protocols that determined how household operations should be conducted. The gardeners who maintained Thornfield Manor's extensive grounds reported unusual disturbances in soil conditions around certain areas of the property, though they were unable to determine whether these changes resulted from natural causes, animal activity, or human intervention. Some mentioned feeling uncomfortable while working alone in remote sections of the gardens, particularly areas where Elena had been observed sketching during her brief stay at the manor. As winter approached, Charles made the decision to leave Thornfield Manor indefinitely, unable to continue living in a household where he suspected his father of involvement in Elena's disappearance. His departure represented a fundamental break with family traditions that had maintained continuity of residence and management for 3 generations, leaving Harrison Jr. as the sole occupant of a mansion that had been designed to accommodate large family gatherings and extensive social activities. Harrison Jr.'s solitary occupation of Thornfield Manor created new patterns of life that reflected both his advanced age and his isolation from the social networks that had previously sustained the family's prominence within regional society. The household staff was reduced to essential personnel. Many rooms were closed and maintained only minimally, and the elaborate entertaining that had once characterized life at the manor ceased. Entirely, Mrs. Patterson remained as housekeeper, but her responsibilities shifted from managing a complex household operation to maintaining a residence that had become more like a museum of family history than a living family home. She found herself serving as the primary keeper of Blackwood family memories and traditions, a role that required her to preserve both the physical artifacts of family life and the intangible knowledge about family relationships, business affairs, and social connections that might otherwise be lost. The blue room where Elena had stayed was kept exactly as she had left it, with her belongings arranged as they had been on the morning of her disappearance. Harrison Jr. had given strict instructions that nothing in the room should be disturbed, though he never explained his reasons for this decision or indicated whether he expected Elena might someday return to claim her possessions. Years passed in this suspended state of waiting, with Thornfield Manor serving as a monument to unresolved grief, family conflict, and unanswered questions about Elena's fate. Harrison Jr. aged into elderly isolation, while Charles built a new life in distant cities, pursuing artistic and political interests that his father had never understood or accepted. Asterisk, the manor's isolation from contemporary life deepened as the social and economic changes of the 1940s and 1950s transformed the region around it. The textile mills that had provided the Blackwood fortune were sold to larger corporations. The grand social gatherings that had once filled the ballroom became memories preserved only in faded photographs, and the extensive grounds were maintained by a skeleton crew of workers who understood their jobs in terms of preservation rather than active use. Mrs. Patterson continued her vigil as housekeeper and keeper of family history, growing old in service to a household that had become a shrine to vanished possibilities and unresolved mysteries. Her daily routines included regular visits to the Blue Room, where Elena's belongings remained undisturbed and her unfinished painting continued to capture light from windows that looked out on gardens growing wild with neglect. The local community developed its own understanding of the mysteries surrounding Thornfield Manor, creating oral traditions that blended factual knowledge with speculation and rumor. Some residents believed that Elena had been murdered and buried somewhere on the manor grounds, while others theorized that she had been paid or threatened to leave the area and assume a new identity elsewhere. These community speculations were complicated by the manor's increasing reputation as a place where unexplained phenomena occurred with disturbing regularity. Delivery workers reported hearing piano music from rooms that had been empty for years. Gardeners mentioned seeing figures in windows of unoccupied areas, and occasional visitors described encounters with a woman who resembled Elena but vanished when approached directly. Dr. Margaret Foster, the physician who served the rural community surrounding Thornfield Manor, developed her own theories about the psychological impacts of unresolved loss on both individual family members and the broader community that had been affected by Elena's disappearance. She observed increased rates of anxiety, depression, and sleep disturbances among residents who lived near the manor, though she was careful not to attribute these conditions directly to supernatural causes. Dr. Foster's medical notes documented patterns of psychological distress that seemed to correlate with proximity to Thornfield Manor and with the length of time individuals had been aware of Elena's story. Long-term residents who had known Elena personally showed the most severe symptoms, while newcomers to the area often developed similar conditions after learning about the unsolved disappearance and spending time near the manor grounds. The physicians' observations suggested that unresolved mysteries could create psychological impacts that extended far beyond the immediate family and friends of missing persons. Communities could be affected by collective trauma that persisted across generations, creating atmospheric conditions that influenced the mental health and social relationships of residents who had no direct connection to the original events. Harrison Blackwood Jr. died in the winter of 1963, alone except for Mrs. Patterson and the small household staff that had remained loyal to the family, despite the manor's transformation from vibrant family home to isolated monument of vanished grandeur. His death marked the end of direct Blackwood family residence at Thornfield Manor, as Charles had established his own life elsewhere and showed no interest in returning to claim his inheritance. The estate passed into legal limbo as lawyers attempted to locate Charles and determine his intentions regarding the property. Mrs. Patterson remained at the manor as caretaker, maintaining the house and grounds while legal proceedings slowly worked their way through probate court. The Blue Room continued to preserve Elena's belongings exactly as they had been left 25 years earlier, creating a time capsule that defied the normal processes of grief and healing. Charles was eventually located in San Francisco, where he had built a successful career as an art dealer specializing in works by political refugees and socially conscious artists. When contacted about his inheritance, he expressed no interest in returning to Thornfield Manor, but indicated that he would not oppose efforts to preserve the property as a historical site or convert it to some form of public use. These developments opened possibilities for finally addressing the mysteries that had surrounded Thornfield Manor for decades, but they also raised complex questions about how to honor both the family's legitimate historical significance and the unresolved tragedy that had shaped the manor's identity. The estate represented both architectural heritage worthy of preservation and a crime scene that had never been properly investigated using modern forensic techniques. As arrangements were made to convert Thornfield Manor into a historical museum, workers preparing the property for public access made discoveries that shed new light on Elena's disappearance and the family secrets that had been hidden within the mansion's walls for generations. Behind false walls in the basement, they found rooms that had been used for purposes not mentioned in any family records or household accounts. These hidden spaces contained evidence of activities that explained the source of tensions between Charles and his father, and that provided new understanding of why Elena's presence at the manor had been perceived as such a serious threat to family interests. The discoveries revealed that Thornfield Manor had been used for decades as a center for financial transactions, political meetings, and business relationships that the Blackwood family had kept carefully hidden from public scrutiny. Elena's artistic talents and political connections had apparently made her a witness to activities that powerful interests wanted to keep secret, and her disappearance had been arranged to prevent her from sharing knowledge that could have exposed criminal enterprises extending far beyond the Blackwood family's textile business. Her fate became clear only when investigators were able to examine evidence that had been concealed within the manor's structure for over 30 years. The resolution of Elena's case brought closure to a mystery that had haunted the regional community for decades, but it also revealed the extent to which criminal activities had been hidden within seemingly respectable institutions and family enterprises. Thornfield Manor's transformation into a museum would preserve both its architectural significance and its value as a reminder that secrets kept too long inevitably find their way to light, and that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. The Riverside neighborhood sits in the heart of the old industrial district, where brick buildings that once housed textile mills and manufacturing plants have been converted into apartments, artist studios, and small businesses that serve the diverse community of residents who have made their homes among the architectural remnants of the city's manufacturing past. Narrow streets wind between buildings whose facades still bear the painted advertisements and company names of businesses that closed decades ago, creating an urban landscape where past and present coexist in layers of accumulated history. Detective Sarah Chun had walked these streets for 15 years, first as a patrol officer learning the rhythms and relationships that governed neighborhood life, then as an investigator specializing in cases that required deep understanding of community dynamics and the informal networks of information that connected residents, shop owners, and the various characters who populated the area's coffee shops, bars, and community centers. The Riverside neighborhood attracted people who valued affordable rent, artistic inspiration, and the kind of urban authenticity that could not be replicated in newer developments built without reference to the industrial history that gave older areas their distinctive character. Young professionals mixed with longtime residents whose families had lived in the neighborhood for generations, creating a social environment that was both diverse and cohesive, held together by shared appreciation for community life that emphasized cooperation over competition. But beneath the neighborhood's reputation for artistic creativity and social consciousness lay currents of mystery and unresolved tension that Detective Chun had learned to recognize through years of investigating crimes that ranged from simple theft to complex cases involving fraud, organized crime, and disappearances that seemed to follow patterns invisible to casual observers but unmistakable to those who understood the hidden geography of urban life. The most persistent mystery in Detective Chun's files involved a series of disappearances that had occurred over the past 8 years, all involving residents of the Riverside neighborhood who had vanished without explanation, while going about routine activities in familiar locations. The cases shared characteristics that suggested connections beyond simple coincidence, but the patterns were subtle enough that they had not attracted attention from supervisors who were focused on more dramatic crimes with clearer investigative leads. The first documented case dated to March 2015 when David Park, a photographer who specialized in urban architecture, had disappeared while documenting buildings scheduled for demolition in the neighborhood's ongoing gentrification process. David had lived in a converted loft space above what had once been a button factory, sharing the building with other artists and small business owners who had transformed the industrial space into a thriving creative community. David's photographic work focused on capturing the architectural details and historical features of buildings before they were renovated or demolished, creating a visual archive that preserved the neighborhood's industrial heritage for future generations. His photographs had been featured in local newspapers, community newsletters, and gallery exhibitions that celebrated the area's unique character and its residents. efforts to maintain affordable housing and workspace in the face of increasing development pressure. On the evening of March 15, 2015, David had left his loft carrying camera equipment and mentioning to neighbors that he planned to photograph the interior of the old Riverside manufacturing building before demolition work began the following week. The building had been empty for over a decade, its windows boarded and its entrances secured with chains and padlocks. But David had obtained permission from the demolition company to document the interior spaces before they were destroyed. David never returned to his loft. His camera equipment was found 3 days later by demolition workers, arranged neatly on a table in what had been the manufacturing building's main office, positioned as if David had been preparing to pack up after completing his photographic work. The cameras were undamaged, and the memory cards contained dozens of images showing the building's interior in careful detail. But there was no indication of what had happened to David himself. Detective Chun's investigation revealed that David had indeed obtained proper permission for his photographic project and had entered the building legally through arrangements made with both the demolition company and the property management firm that represented the building's current owners. Security guards had seen him enter the building that evening, and his keycard access showed he had moved through various sections of the structure over a period of several hours. The photographs on David's memory cards documented his systematic exploration of the building, showing empty manufacturing floors, abandoned office spaces, and architectural details that would soon be lost to demolition. The images revealed David's characteristic attention to historical features and his skill at capturing the play of light and shadow that gave industrial spaces their distinctive atmosphere. Most puzzling was the final sequence of photographs, which showed David's reflection in mirrors and windows as he documented a series of basement rooms that had not been mentioned in the building plans provided by the demolition company. These images suggested that David had discovered areas of the building that were not part of the official architectural records, spaces that might have been used for purposes not documented in the property's legal history. Detective Chun's efforts to locate these basement rooms during her investigation were unsuccessful, as demolition work had proceeded on schedule despite David's disappearance, and the building had been reduced to rubble before a comprehensive search could be conducted. The demolition company's records showed no knowledge of basement spaces beyond those indicated in standard building plans, and property management representatives claimed no familiarity with areas that David's photographs had clearly documented. Investigation into David's disappearance was complicated by the neighborhood's complex relationship with law enforcement and the reluctance of some residents to provide information that might lead to increased police presence in an area that prized its independence and its informal systems of community self-governance. Many residents had experienced harassment or discrimination by police in other contexts, creating barriers to cooperation that made detective work more challenging. However, Detective Chun's long history in the neighborhood and her reputation for treating residents with respect and understanding gradually overcame these barriers, and she was able to develop relationships that provided access to information not readily available through official channels. Residents began sharing observations about unusual activities in and around the old manufacturing buildings, patterns of behavior by individuals who seemed to be conducting business in the neighborhood without establishing visible connections to the community. These informal interviews revealed that David's disappearance was not an isolated incident, though the connections between various cases had not been immediately apparent, because the missing persons came from different social and professional circles within the neighborhood's diverse population. The pattern became visible only when Detective Chun began mapping the locations and circumstances of multiple disappearances against the neighborhood's physical geography and social networks. The second case involved Maria Santos, a social worker who had vanished in August 2016 while conducting outreach work with homeless individuals who sheltered in abandoned buildings throughout the Riverside area. Maria worked for a nonprofit organization that provided services to people experiencing housing insecurity, and her job required her to visit locations that other service providers considered too dangerous or difficult to access. Maria's work brought her into contact with individuals who lived outside mainstream social systems, including people with mental health issues, substance abuse problems, and criminal records that made them reluctant to seek help through official channels. She had developed expertise in building trust with vulnerable populations and providing services in ways that respected their autonomy and avoided the bureaucratic requirements that often prevented people from accessing help they needed. On August 23, 2016, Maria had planned to visit several locations where homeless individuals were known to shelter, including basement areas of abandoned buildings, unused sections of the city's storm sewer system, and informal encampments in vacant lots and under highway overpasses. Her supervisor at the nonprofit organization expected her to return by evening with reports on the individuals she had encountered and the services they might need. Maria's car was found the following morning in the parking lot of a convenience store near the edge of the neighborhood, locked and undisturbed, with her purse and professional materials on the front seat. Her service logs indicated that she had successfully visited 3 planned locations and had provided assistance to several individuals, but there was no record of her activities after approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Detective Chun's investigation into Maria's disappearance revealed the complexity of providing social services to populations that existed largely outside official systems of support and documentation. Many of the individuals Maria served were reluctant to speak with police officers, either because of their own legal problems or because of general mistrust of law enforcement, based on previous negative experiences through patient relationship building and collaboration with other social service providers. Detective Chun was eventually able to interview several individuals who had encountered Maria on the day of her disappearance. These interviews revealed that Maria had been asking questions about unusual activities in abandoned buildings, particularly about people who seemed to be using empty structures for purposes other than simple shelter. According to these witnesses, Maria had mentioned concerns about organized criminal activities that were exploiting vulnerable populations, including schemes that involved recruiting homeless individuals for illegal activities in exchange for temporary housing, food, or money. She had been documenting evidence of these operations as part of her professional responsibilities, but she had also expressed concerns about potential dangers to both service providers and the vulnerable people they were trying to help. The information gathered through these interviews suggested that Maria's disappearance might have been connected to her discovery of criminal activities that someone wanted to keep hidden from both law enforcement and social service agencies. Her work had given her access to information and locations that most people never encountered, making her a potential witness to activities that criminal organizations needed to protect. Detective Chun's investigation expanded to include examination of abandoned buildings throughout the Riverside neighborhood, searching for evidence of organized criminal activities that might have motivated Maria's disappearance. These searches revealed that several seemingly empty structures were being used for purposes that were not immediately visible but became apparent through careful observation of patterns of access, utility usage, and modifications to building interiors. The third major case in Detective Chun's files involved the disappearance of James Morrison, a community organizer who had vanished in November 2018 while researching the ownership and development plans for properties throughout the Riverside neighborhood. James worked with tenant organizations, small business associations, and community groups that were concerned about gentrification, processes that threatened to displace long-time residents and change the character of the area. James's research focused on identifying the individuals and corporations behind property acquisitions, development projects, and rent increases that were affecting neighborhood residents. His work required him to examine public records, attend city planning meetings, and investigate business relationships that were often obscured through complex corporate structures and legal arrangements designed to limit public scrutiny. On November 8, 2018, James had planned to meet with a potential source who claimed to have information about illegal activities connected to neighborhood development projects. The meeting was scheduled for evening hours at a location in the industrial section of the area, away from the residential streets where James was well known and easily recognized. James never returned from this meeting, and efforts to contact the individual who had requested the meeting proved unsuccessful, as the phone number and email address provided had been created specifically for the purpose of arranging the encounter and could not be traced to any actual person. James's apartment contained extensive files related to his research, including documents that suggested patterns of coordination between development companies, city officials, and criminal organizations. Detective Chun's investigation into James's disappearance revealed the extent to which neighborhood development processes had been influenced by criminal enterprises seeking to launder money through real estate investments, manipulate property values through intimidation and illegal activities, and establish legitimate business operations that could serve as covers for ongoing criminal enterprises. James's research files contained evidence of systematic efforts to force out longtime residents through harassment, artificial rent increases, and deliberate deterioration of building conditions. These activities were coordinated by networks that included legitimate businesses, corrupt city officials, and criminal organizations that used violence and intimidation to advance their economic interests. The three disappearances began to form a pattern when Detective Chun mapped them against the physical and social geography of the Riverside neighborhood. All three missing persons had been investigating different aspects of activities that seemed to be connected to the same criminal enterprises. David Park had discovered hidden spaces in buildings scheduled for demolition. Maria Santos had uncovered exploitation of vulnerable populations, and James Morrison had documented corruption in development processes. Detective Chun's comprehensive investigation revealed that the Riverside neighborhood had become a testing ground for sophisticated criminal operations that combined traditional, organized crime activities with modern techniques of financial manipulation, political corruption, and social control. The neighborhood's reputation for independence and creativity provided cover for activities that would have attracted more attention in areas with greater police presence and more conventional social structures. The criminal enterprises operating in Riverside had learned to exploit the neighborhood's strengths, diversity, creativity, community cooperation, in ways that advanced their own interests while undermining the social cohesion that residents valued. They had identified community leaders, social service providers, and investigative individuals who posed threats to their operations, and they had developed methods for eliminating these threats while maintaining the appearance of random disappearances or voluntary departures. Detective Chun's investigation attracted attention from federal law enforcement agencies that had been tracking similar criminal operations in other cities, and her work became part of a broader effort to understand how organized crime had adapted to operate in urban neighborhoods where traditional law enforcement approaches were less effective due to community dynamics and resource limitations. The collaboration between local and federal investigators revealed that the Riverside neighborhood was part of a network of similar areas in cities across the region, all of which had been targeted by criminal organizations that specialized in exploiting communities with limited law enforcement presence, diverse populations, and informal economic systems that provided opportunities for money laundering and other illegal activities. As Detective Chun's investigation continued, she worked with community organizations to develop safety protocols that could protect residents and community leaders from the criminal enterprises that had infiltrated neighborhood life. These efforts required delicate balance between maintaining the independence and creativity that made Riverside attractive to its residents while providing protection from criminal activities that threatened both individual safety and community cohesion. The detectives' work also revealed the importance of community-based approaches to crime prevention that recognized the unique characteristics of neighborhoods like Riverside and built on existing social networks and cultural resources, rather than imposing external solutions that might undermine the very qualities that made these communities strong and resilient. Through patient investigation and community collaboration, Detective Chun was able to piece together evidence that led to arrests and prosecutions that disrupted the criminal enterprises operating in Riverside. Though she recognized that maintaining community safety would require ongoing vigilance and cooperation between law enforcement and residents committed to preserving their neighborhood's character while protecting it from exploitation by criminal interests. The cases of David Park, Maria Santos, and James Morrison served as reminders that urban communities faced complex challenges that required sophisticated responses, and that the safety and character of neighborhoods like Riverside depended on the dedication of individuals willing to investigate threats, document problems, and work persistently toward solutions that honored both community values and the need for security. In an urban environment where danger and opportunity often existed side by side, the detectives' files remained open, documenting not only the specific crimes that had been solved, but also the ongoing efforts required to maintain community safety in an urban neighborhood where residents continued to build lives that balanced creativity, independence, and mutual support against the challenges posed by criminal enterprises that sought to exploit the very qualities that made places like Riverside special and worth protecting. The Way Station Inn stands at the crossroads of three county highways, its weathered clapboard siding and wraparound porch speaking to over a century of providing hospitality to travelers making their way through the rural countryside of central Pennsylvania. Built in 1887 to serve stagecoach passengers and later adapted for automobile travelers, the inn occupies a strategic location where roads converge and separate, directing visitors toward destinations that stretch across several states and countless small communities nestled in the valleys and hills of Appalachian foothills. For 5 generations, the Kellerman family operated the Way Station Inn, passing down not only the business responsibilities of maintaining comfortable accommodations and serving hearty meals, but also the unofficial role of keeper of stories and secrets that accumulated like dust in the corners of rooms that had sheltered thousands of travelers over the decades. Each generation of Kellermans learned to recognize the subtle signs that distinguished ordinary travelers from those carrying unusual burdens, dangerous intentions, or mysterious purposes that required careful observation and discreet handling. The inn's guest register, maintained continuously since opening day, contained signatures from traveling salesmen, vacationing families, business executives, government officials, and the occasional celebrity seeking privacy during journeys between major cities. But interspersed among these routine entries were names and stories that reflected the darker currents that sometimes flowed through the crossroads where the inn maintained its quiet vigil over the intersection of converging roads and intersecting lives. Eleanor Kellerman inherited operation of the Way Station Inn from her father in 1962, bringing to the role a combination of natural hospitality and intuitive understanding of human nature that served her well in managing the complex dynamics of a business that attracted both routine travelers and individuals whose purposes were less straightforward. Eleanor had grown up in the inn, learning from childhood to read the subtle cues that indicated whether guests were likely to cause problems, require special attention, or contribute to the peaceful atmosphere that regular customers had come to expect. The inn's reputation for discretion and privacy made it attractive to travelers who preferred to avoid the scrutiny that might accompany stays at larger hotels or more publicly visible accommodations. business executives conducting sensitive negotiations, government officials traveling on confidential assignments, and individuals involved in personal situations requiring privacy all found their way to the Waystation Inn, drawn by word-of-mouth recommendations from previous guests who had appreciated the establishment's commitment to minding its own business while providing excellent service. But discretion could become complicity when guests used the inn's privacy to facilitate activities that extended beyond simple desire for confidentiality into realms of criminal behavior that put other guests, staff members, and the broader community at risk. Eleanor learned through experience to distinguish between legitimate needs for privacy and situations that might require more active intervention, though this knowledge sometimes placed her in difficult positions that required careful judgment and considerable courage. The first indication that the Waystation Inn's role as neutral ground for travelers might be compromised came in the autumn of 1963, when a guest who had registered under the name William Carson disappeared from his room during the night, leaving behind personal belongings that raised questions about both his identity and his purposes for staying at the inn. Carson had arrived by automobile on a rainy Tuesday evening, requesting a room for what he described as an indefinite stay while conducting business in the surrounding area. Carson appeared to be a well-dressed businessman in his early 40s, carrying expensive luggage and speaking with the confident manner of someone accustomed to comfortable accommodations and attentive service. He paid for his room in advance, using crisp $20 bills, tipped the staff generously, and expressed appreciation for the inn's quiet atmosphere and its distance from the noise and crowds of larger towns. During his 3-day stay, Carson made several phone calls from the inn's lobby telephone, conversations that Eleanor could not help overhearing due to the acoustic properties of the building's wooden construction. These conversations involved references to meetings, schedules, and financial arrangements that suggested Carson was coordinating complex business activities with multiple parties in different locations. Carson also received visitors during his stay, well-dressed men who arrived in expensive automobiles and met with him in the inn's small parlor, speaking in low voices about matters that seemed to require considerable privacy and careful planning. Eleanor respected her guests' need for confidentiality, but she could not help noticing that these meetings had an intensity and urgency that seemed unusual for routine business discussions. On Friday morning, October 18, 1963, Carson failed to appear for breakfast, an absence that initially seemed unremarkable since he had mentioned the possibility of early morning appointments that might require him to leave before the dining room opened. But when Carson had not returned by evening and had not responded to messages left at his door, Eleanor used her master key to check his room and ensure that he had not suffered a medical emergency. Carson's room appeared to have been vacated in haste, with clothing scattered across the floor and personal items abandoned on the dresser and nightstand. Most significantly, Carson had left behind a briefcase containing documents that revealed his true identity as Albert Morrison, a federal investigator working undercover to document organized crime activities in the rural areas where major cities. Criminal enterprises had begun establishing operations away from urban law enforcement attention. The documents in Morrison's briefcase indicated that he had been investigating a network of criminal activities centered around the Crossroads location, where the Waystation Inn provided convenient accommodations for meetings between criminal organization representatives from different cities. The inn's isolated location, its tradition of discretion, and its position at the intersection of major transportation routes made it an ideal neutral meeting ground for criminal enterprises that needed to coordinate activities across wide geographic areas. Eleanor's discovery of Morrison's true identity placed her in an extremely dangerous position, as she realized that some of her recent guests had likely been members of organized crime groups who would not hesitate to eliminate potential witnesses to their activities. Her knowledge of Morrison's investigation made her a threat to criminal operations that involved substantial financial stakes and powerful individuals who had the resources and motivation to protect their interests through violent means. Eleanor contacted the FBI field office in Philadelphia, reporting Morrison's disappearance and turning over the documents she had found in his room. Federal agents arrived at the Way Station Inn within hours, beginning an investigation that revealed the extent to which the inn had been unknowingly serving as headquarters for criminal activities that stretched across multiple states and involved numerous illegal enterprises. The FBI investigation disclosed that Morrison's cover had been compromised by a leak within federal law enforcement agencies, alerting the criminal organizations he was investigating to his true identity and purposes. His disappearance had been carefully planned to eliminate a threat to operations that generated millions of dollars in illegal profits and involved corruption of public officials at multiple levels of government. Morrison's body was never recovered, though federal investigators developed evidence indicating that he had been murdered by professional killers employed by the criminal organizations he had been investigating. His death served as a warning to other law enforcement officers and potential witnesses about the consequences of interfering with criminal enterprises that had the resources and ruthlessness to eliminate threats through extreme violence. The investigation into Morrison's death revealed that the Way Station Inn had been selected as a meeting location not randomly, but through careful analysis of facilities that offered the combination of privacy, accessibility, and innocuous appearance that criminal organizations required for conducting sensitive business away from urban areas where their activities might attract unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies. Eleanor found herself serving as a witness in federal criminal prosecutions that resulted in the conviction of numerous individuals involved in organized crime activities, but these legal victories came at considerable personal cost as she faced ongoing threats from criminal associates who blamed her cooperation with law enforcement for the disruption of profitable illegal operations. The notoriety associated with Morrison's disappearance and the subsequent federal investigation changed the character of the Way Station Inn, as its previous reputation for quiet discretion was replaced by awareness that it had been compromised as a location where criminal activities had been conducted under cover of legitimate business operations. Eleanor's efforts to rebuild the inn's reputation as a safe and welcoming accommodation for legitimate travelers required years of careful relationship building with new customers, local community members, and law enforcement agencies that now viewed the establishment as a potential site for ongoing criminal activities that might require continued monitoring and occasional intervention. The inn's guest register from the 1960s and early 1970s documented the gradual transition from serving as an unwitting headquarters for criminal meetings to re-establishing itself as a legitimate hospitality business that attracted tourists, business, travelers, and other guests whose purposes were transparent and legal. But the Way Station Inn's location at the crossroads of major transportation routes continued to make it attractive to individuals whose activities required privacy and whose intentions were not always benign. Eleanor learned to develop more sophisticated methods for screening potential guests, identifying warning signs that might indicate criminal purposes, and establishing protocols for responding to situations that might threaten the safety of legitimate guests and staff members. During the 1970s, the inn attracted attention from individuals involved in drug trafficking operations that used rural highways to transport illegal substances between major cities, taking advantage of lighter law enforcement presence in rural areas and the difficulty of monitoring all possible transportation routes through countryside that offered numerous alternative paths between major destinations. These drug trafficking operations differed from the organized crime meetings of the previous decade, involving younger individuals with different cultural backgrounds and operational methods, but they posed similar risks to the inn's reputation and the safety of guests and staff members who might inadvertently become witnesses to illegal activities. Eleanor's response to these new challenges involved developing relationships with local and state law enforcement agencies establishing communication protocols that allowed her to report suspicious activities without compromising legitimate guests' privacy, and implementing security measures that provided protection while maintaining the welcoming atmosphere that legitimate travelers expected. The inn's role in documenting and reporting criminal activities that occurred in rural areas contributed to broader law enforcement efforts to address the expansion of urban criminal enterprises into countryside locations that had previously been considered relatively safe from organized criminal activities. Eleanor's cooperation with law enforcement agencies helped establish the Waystation Inn as a resource for investigating criminal activities in rural areas, but it also required her to maintain careful balance between supporting law enforcement objectives and preserving the hospitality business that provided her livelihood and served the needs of legitimate travelers who valued the inn's convenient location and comfortable accommodations. The guest register from the 1980s and 1990s reflected the inn's evolution from a site that had attracted criminal activities to an establishment that actively supported law enforcement efforts while maintaining its traditional role as a welcoming accommodation for travelers seeking comfortable lodging at the crossroads of major transportation routes. Eleanor's experience managing the complex challenges of operating a hospitality business in a location that attracted both legitimate and illegitimate activities provided her with insights about rural criminal enterprises, law enforcement strategies, and community safety measures that she shared with other business owners, local officials, and law enforcement agencies working to address criminal activities in rural areas. The Waystation Inn's transformation from unwitting host to active partner in law enforcement efforts demonstrated the importance of community cooperation in addressing criminal activities that exploited rural areas' isolation, limited law enforcement, resources, and the traditional hospitality that made rural communities attractive to both legitimate visitors and criminal enterprises seeking to conduct illegal business away from urban scrutiny. As Eleanor approached retirement age, she reflected on the decades of challenges and changes that had shaped her management of the Waystation Inn, recognizing that her experience represented a microcosm of broader changes in American society, criminal justice, and the ongoing tension between hospitality and security that affected communities throughout rural America. The inn's guest register, maintained faithfully throughout all these changes, served as a historical document recording not only the names and dates of thousands of travelers, but also the evolution of criminal activities, law enforcement responses, and community efforts to maintain safety while preserving the traditions of hospitality and welcome that defined rural American culture. The Waystation Inn continued to serve travelers at the crossroads where three highways converged, but its role had expanded beyond simple hospitality to encompass community leadership, law enforcement cooperation, and historical documentation of the complex challenges faced by rural businesses that found themselves at the intersection of legitimate commerce and criminal enterprise in modern America. St. Catherine's Hospital sits on 15 acres of landscape grounds at the edge of Millfield, its Georgian Revival architecture speaking to the 1920s optimism of community leaders who believed that modern medical care could conquer disease and suffering through scientific progress and dedicated service. The hospital's red brick facade and limestone trim have weathered nearly a century of seasons, sheltering generations of patients, families, and medical staff within walls that have witnessed the full spectrum of human experience, from birth through death, and all the struggles that occur between. The hospital's quiet corridors carry echoes of countless conversations, urgent consultations, and whispered prayers that have filled these spaces during decades of medical care that have transformed both the practice of medicine and the expectations of patients seeking healing in institutional settings far removed from the home-based care that previous generations had considered normal and appropriate. Dr. Margaret Foster had walked these halls for 38 years, arriving as a young resident physician in 1985, when the hospital was struggling to adapt to changes in medical technology. insurance systems, and patient expectations that were reshaping healthcare throughout rural America. Dr. Foster had witnessed the evolution from a small, community hospital serving local farming families to a regional medical center, attracting patients from across 3 counties and providing specialized services that had once been available only in major metropolitan areas. But Dr. Foster's long tenure at St. Catherine's had also made her aware of patterns and incidents that seemed to fall outside the normal challenges of medical practice, events that occurred with sufficient regularity to suggest underlying causes, more complex than random misfortune or statistical clustering of unusual cases. Her position as Chief of Internal Medicine gave her access to comprehensive patient records, staff reports, and administrative data that revealed connections invisible to medical professionals with more limited institutional perspective. The first indication that St. Catherine's might be experiencing problems beyond routine medical complications came in the form of patient deaths that occurred under circumstances that seemed inconsistent with expected medical outcomes based on diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis, factors that normally provided reliable guidance for predicting patient recovery or decline. These deaths were not dramatic incidents that immediately attracted attention from hospital administrators or external investigators, but rather quiet departures that seemed unremarkable when considered individually but formed disturbing patterns when examined collectively over extended periods. Patients who had been responding well to treatment would experience sudden deterioration during night shifts when staffing levels were reduced and supervision was less intensive than during normal business hours. Dr. Foster began documenting these incidents in private notes that she maintained separately from official medical records, recording details about patient conditions, treatment protocols, staff assignments, and timing factors that might eventually reveal explanations for the patterns she was observing. Her notes reflected the methodical approach to problem solving that had made her an effective diagnostician, but they also revealed growing concern about events that seemed to defy medical explanation. The most troubling case in Dr. Foster's private files involved the death of Eleanor Hartwell, a retired school teacher who had been admitted for routine gallbladder surgery in March 1998. Eleanor's surgery had proceeded without complications, and her recovery had been proceeding normally until the 3rd night following the operation, when she experienced sudden cardiac arrest that could not be explained by her medical history, surgical procedures, or post-operative care. Eleanor had no history of heart problems. Her pre-surgical testing had revealed no cardiovascular abnormalities, and her post-operative monitoring had shown normal heart rhythm and blood pressure until the moment of her unexpected cardiac arrest. The medical team's efforts to revive her were unsuccessful, and the autopsy revealed no evidence of heart disease, blood clots, or other conditions that might have caused sudden cardiac death. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest of unknown origin, a designation that satisfied legal and administrative requirements, but did nothing to explain why a healthy 68-year-old woman had died unexpectedly following routine surgery that should have presented minimal risk to her continued health and longevity. Dr. Foster's investigation into Eleanor's death revealed that similar incidents had occurred with disturbing regularity over the previous 5 years, always involving patients who were recovering normally from routine procedures until experiencing sudden, unexplained deterioration during night shifts. The pattern was subtle enough that individual cases could be attributed to normal statistical variation in medical outcomes, but the cumulative effect suggested systematic factors that warranted careful investigation. Dr. Foster's concerns about these unexplained deaths led her to examine staffing patterns, medication protocols, and equipment maintenance records that might reveal common factors linking the cases. Her investigation revealed that most of the suspicious deaths had occurred during shifts when a particular night shift nurse, Linda Morrison, was assigned to the medical floors where post-surgical patients received recovery care. Linda Morrison had worked at St. Catherine's Hospital for 12 years, earning recognition as a dedicated and competent nurse whose technical skills and patient care abilities had made her a valued member of the hospital's nursing staff. Her performance evaluations consistently rated her work as exemplary, and she had received commendations from supervisors, colleagues, and patients' families who appreciated her apparent compassion and professional competence. But Dr. Foster's analysis of patient records revealed that deaths classified as unexplained medical complications occurred at significantly higher rates during shifts when Linda Morrison was assigned primary nursing responsibility for patient care. The statistical correlation was strong enough to suggest causation rather than coincidence, though proving criminal intent would require evidence that went beyond circumstantial patterns in patient outcomes. Dr. Foster's investigation faced significant obstacles created by the complexity of modern medical care, which involved multiple staff members, sophisticated equipment, and treatment protocols that made it difficult to isolate individual actions or decisions that might have contributed to negative patient outcomes. Hospitals were designed to function as systems where responsibility was distributed across multiple professionals, creating redundancy that prevented individual errors from causing patient harm, but also making it difficult to identify deliberate misconduct. The doctor's concerns about Linda Morrison's possible involvement in patient deaths were complicated by the nurse's reputation for exceptional patient care and her apparent emotional distress when patients under her care experienced unexpected complications. Linda's colleagues considered her to be among the most caring and dedicated nurses on the hospital staff, making allegations of intentional harm seem inconsistent with her demonstrated commitment to patient welfare. Dr. Foster's investigation required her to balance professional obligations to protect patient safety with legal and ethical considerations about making accusations against a colleague without definitive proof of criminal behavior. False accusations could destroy Linda Morrison's career and reputation while exposing Dr. Foster to legal liability for defamation, but failure to act on legitimate suspicions could allow continued harm to patients whose lives depended on receiving safe and appropriate medical care. The doctor's dilemma was resolved when she discovered evidence that Linda Morrison had been accessing medications in quantities that exceeded the amounts required for authorized patient care, suggesting that she was diverting controlled substances for purposes not related to legitimate medical treatment. This discovery provided grounds for reporting her concerns to hospital administrators and law enforcement agencies without relying solely on statistical correlations that might not have been sufficient to support criminal charges. The investigation into Linda Morrison's activities revealed that she had been systematically stealing narcotics and other controlled medications from hospital supplies, using her access to medication storage areas and her knowledge of inventory control systems to obtain drugs for personal use and for sale to individuals outside the hospital who were seeking pharmaceutical substances for non-medical purposes. More disturbing was the discovery that Linda had been administering excessive doses of certain medications to patients under her care, apparently to create medical emergencies that would require additional narcotics for pain management and emergency treatment, providing her with opportunities to divert larger quantities of controlled substances without triggering inventory discrepancies that might have revealed her theft. The patients who had died during Linda Morrison's shifts had been victims of deliberate overdoses of medications that caused cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, or other medical crises that appeared to result from natural complications but actually represented homicides committed to facilitate drug theft and to eliminate potential witnesses who might have observed her suspicious activities. Linda Morrison's arrest and prosecution for multiple counts of murder revealed the extent to which she had exploited her position of trust and professional authority to commit crimes that had resulted in the deaths of at least 8 patients over a 5-year period. Her actions had violated every principle of medical ethics and professional responsibility while using her knowledge of hospital procedures and medication effects to commit nearly perfect crimes that might never have been detected without Dr. Foster's careful investigation. The case highlighted vulnerabilities in hospital security systems that had been designed to prevent accidental medication errors, but had proven inadequate to prevent deliberate criminal abuse by staff members with authorized access to controlled substances and patient care areas. The revelation that a trusted nurse had been systematically murdering patients for personal financial gain shattered assumptions about professional integrity and institutional safety that had been fundamental to public confidence in medical care. The impact of Linda Morrison's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families to affect every aspect of St. Catherine's Hospital operations, requiring comprehensive reviews of medication storage procedures, patient monitoring, protocols, and staff supervision systems that had failed to prevent or detect criminal activities that had continued for years under the cover of normal medical operations. Dr. Foster's role in exposing Linda Morrison's crimes established her as an expert on hospital security issues and criminal detection in medical settings, leading to consulting opportunities with other hospitals seeking to improve their ability to identify and prevent similar criminal activities by staff members who might exploit their positions of trust for illegal purposes. The doctor's experience with the Morrison case also revealed the psychological toll that such investigations placed on medical professionals who were forced to balance their commitment to patient care with the disturbing reality that some colleagues might pose threats to patient safety that required constant vigilance and systematic monitoring to detect and prevent. St. Catherine's Hospital implemented comprehensive reforms following the Morrison case, establishing new procedures for medication security, patient monitoring, and staff supervision that were designed to prevent similar crimes while maintaining the collaborative atmosphere and professional trust that were essential for effective medical care. These reforms served as models for other hospitals seeking to balance security concerns with the need to maintain positive working environments for medical professionals. The hospital's reputation recovered gradually as community members came to understand that the Morrison case represented criminal behavior by an individual rather than institutional failures that reflected broader problems with medical care quality or patient safety protocols. The transparency with which hospital administrators addressed the crisis and implemented corrective measures helped restore public confidence in the institution's commitment to patient welfare. Dr. Foster continued her work at St. Catherine's Hospital for several more years, serving not only as a physician, but also as an informal guardian of institutional integrity, who remained alert to patterns or incidents that might indicate problems requiring investigation and corrective action. Her experience with the Morrison case had made her aware that healthcare settings could attract individuals with criminal intentions, and that maintaining patient safety required constant attention to factors that extended beyond purely medical considerations. The doctor's private files, maintained throughout her career, documented not only the Morrison case, but also other incidents that had required careful investigation to distinguish between normal medical complications and events that might have indicated criminal activity, equipment failures, or procedural problems that required corrective action to prevent harm to future patients. As Dr. Foster approached retirement, she reflected on the complex responsibilities that medical professionals bore not only for providing effective patient care, but also for maintaining the ethical standards and institutional integrity that were essential for public trust in healthcare systems. Her experience had demonstrated that vigilance and systematic observation could prevent criminal activities that might otherwise continue undetected for years. The legacy of the Morrison case at St. Catherine's Hospital served as a reminder that medical institutions were not immune to criminal activity, and that protecting patient safety required comprehensive approaches that addressed both medical risks and security threats that could emerge from within the healthcare system itself. The case had revealed that even the most trusted professionals could pose threats to patient welfare, and that effective hospital administration required systems capable of detecting and preventing criminal behavior while preserving the collaborative relationships essential for high-quality medical care. Dr. Foster's careful documentation and persistent investigation had saved countless lives by exposing criminal activities that might otherwise have continued indefinitely, demonstrating that individual professionals could make decisive differences in institutional safety through their commitment to patient welfare and their willingness to act on concerns that less vigilant observers might have dismissed as statistical anomalies or unexplained medical complications. Asterisk, the Whitmore Public Library stands in the center of town like a monument to learning and civic pride. Its Carnegie-era architecture embodying the early 20th century belief that free access to knowledge could elevate communities and transform individual lives through education and enlightenment. Built in 1908 with funding from Andrew Carnegie's library program, the building's classical columns and carved stone details speak to ambitions that extended far beyond simply housing books, representing hopes that libraries could serve as democratic institutions where all citizens might find the information and inspiration needed for personal growth and civic engagement. The library's collection had grown steadily over more than a century of acquisitions, donations, and bequests, filling 4 floors with books, periodicals, manuscripts, and archival materials that documented not only the intellectual interests of the community, but also the personal and professional lives of generations of residents who had contributed papers, correspondence, and private records to create a comprehensive repository of local history and culture. Librarian Janet Pierce had worked among these collections for 23 years, developing intimate familiarity with materials that ranged from contemporary bestsellers and reference works to rare books and historical documents that were consulted primarily by researchers, genealogists, and local historians seeking information about the community's past. Her position as head librarian gave her responsibility for acquisitions, cataloging, and preservation of materials that represented the accumulated knowledge and memory of several generations of Whitmore residents. But Janet's long tenure at the Poway Library had also made her aware that some materials in the collection contained information that went beyond simple historical documentation to include evidence of criminal activities, family secrets, and community controversies that had been deliberately hidden from public knowledge but had found their way into private papers that were later donated to the library's archives without careful examination of their contents. The most significant discovery in Janet's experience came through her work with the Morrison Family Papers, a collection of personal documents, business records, and correspondence that had been donated to the library following the death of Elizabeth Morrison, a prominent community member whose family had been involved in local business and politics for over 80 years. The Morrison Papers were expected to provide valuable insights into the community's commercial and political development during the mid-20th century, making them attractive to researchers studying regional history and economic development. Janet's initial review of the Morrison collection revealed the expected materials: business correspondence, financial records, family photographs, and personal letters that documented the family's involvement in various community activities and their relationships with other prominent local families. But deeper examination of the collection uncovered materials that told a more complex and disturbing story about activities that had been carefully hidden from public scrutiny for decades. Among the business records were documents that revealed the Morrison family's involvement in financial transactions that appeared to violate federal banking regulations, state tax laws, and local ordinances governing commercial activities in Whitmore. These documents suggested that the family business had served as a front for money laundering operations that helped criminal organizations convert illegally obtained funds into apparently legitimate assets through real estate investments, business acquisitions, and financial arrangements designed to obscure the original sources of the money. More disturbing were personal letters and diary entries that documented the family's knowledge of violent crimes committed by individuals who were business partners or associates in the money laundering operations. These materials revealed that Elizabeth Morrison and other family members had been aware of murders, assaults, and intimidation campaigns directed against community members who had discovered or threatened to expose the criminal activities that were generating substantial profits for local business leaders and their criminal associates. Janet's discovery of these materials placed her in a difficult position that required her to balance her professional responsibilities as a librarian with her civic duties as a citizen who had uncovered evidence of serious crimes that might still have legal implications despite the passage of time since the original incidents had occurred. The materials in the Morrison collection suggested that several unexplained disappearances and deaths in Whitmore during the 1960s and 1970s had actually been murders committed to protect criminal enterprises that involved prominent community members. The librarian's dilemma was complicated by the fact that some of the individuals named in the Morrison papers were still alive and held positions of respect and authority within the community, while others had children and grandchildren who had built their own lives and reputations without knowledge of their family's involvement in criminal activities. Making the information public could destroy innocent people's lives and reputations while serving little constructive purpose if the crimes were too old to prosecute effectively. Janet consulted with legal experts, library professional organizations, and law enforcement agencies to determine her obligations regarding materials that contained evidence of criminal activities but had been donated to the library without any expectation that they would be used for law enforcement purposes. These consultations revealed that libraries faced complex ethical and legal challenges when their collections included materials that documented criminal activities, particularly when the information involved prominent community members or ongoing criminal enterprises. The legal experts advised Janet that she had both the right and potentially the obligation to report criminal evidence to appropriate law enforcement agencies, but they also warned that doing so might expose the library to legal challenges from individuals who claimed that their privacy rights had been violated through unauthorized disclosure of personal materials that had been donated with expectations of scholarly rather than investigative use. Janet's investigation into the Morrison papers revealed that they were not unique in containing evidence of criminal activities, and that other collections in the library's archives included materials that documented various forms of illegal behavior by individuals and organizations that had operated in Whitmore over the decades. The library's role as a repository for personal papers and business records had made it an inadvertent archive of criminal evidence that had been preserved through the normal processes of historical preservation rather than through deliberate law enforcement documentation. The librarian's growing awareness of the criminal evidence in various collections led her to conduct a comprehensive review of archival materials that might contain information relevant to unsolved crimes, ongoing criminal investigations, or historical cases that might warrant renewed law enforcement attention. This review revealed that the library's archives contained one of the most complete documentation of criminal activities in the community's history. Though this information had been scattered across numerous collections and had never been examined systematically for law enforcement purposes, Janet's work attracted attention from Detective Raymond Martinez, the state police investigator who had been working on cold cases involving missing persons and unsolved crimes in rural communities throughout the region. Detective Martinez recognized that library archives represented potentially valuable sources of information about criminal activities that had occurred before modern record-keeping systems and investigative techniques had made criminal evidence more accessible to law enforcement agencies. The collaboration between Janet Pierce and Detective Martinez led to the development of new approaches to using archival materials for criminal investigations, establishing protocols that balance the privacy rights of individuals whose papers were housed in library, collections with the law enforcement community's legitimate needs for access to historical information that might help solve crimes or identify criminal patterns that had previously been invisible to investigators. Their work revealed that the Morrison family had been part of a criminal network that extended far beyond Whitmore to include criminal organizations operating throughout the region, using small-town businesses and community institutions as fronts for illegal activities that generated substantial profits while maintaining the appearance of legitimate commercial operations. The network had included banks, real estate companies, construction firms, and political organizations that had coordinated their activities to facilitate money laundering, tax evasion, and various forms of fraud and extortion. The criminal network's operations had been protected by corruption that reached into law enforcement agencies, court systems, and government offices at local, county, and state levels, making it extremely difficult for honest officials to investigate or prosecute criminal activities without facing retaliation that could destroy their careers and endanger their personal safety. The network's influence had been so extensive that many community members had been aware of criminal activities but had felt powerless to report them through normal legal channels. Janet and Detective Martinez's investigation revealed that several prominent community members who had died under apparently natural circumstances had actually been murdered to prevent them from exposing criminal activities or testifying in legal proceedings that might have disrupted the network's operations. These murders had been carefully planned to appear accidental or result from natural causes, using methods that would not have been detectable through the forensic techniques available during the periods when they occurred. The library's archives contained correspondence, diary entries, and business records that documented the planning and execution of these murders, providing evidence that would have been sufficient for criminal prosecutions if the crimes had not been protected by statutes of limitations and the deaths of most of the individuals who had been directly involved in committing them. Investigation also revealed that the criminal network had continued operating into more recent periods, though its leadership and methods had evolved to adapt to changes in law enforcement capabilities, financial regulations, and community awareness of criminal activities. Some family members and business associates of the original network had maintained criminal enterprises that continued to generate illegal profits through updated versions of the money laundering, fraud, and intimidation techniques that had been documented in the historical materials. Asterisk. Detective Martinez's investigation led to arrests and prosecutions of individuals who were continuing criminal activities that had their origins in the network documented in the library's archives, demonstrating that historical criminal evidence could provide valuable insights into contemporary criminal enterprises and help law enforcement agencies understand the evolution and continuity of organized criminal activities in rural communities. Janet's role in these investigations established her as an anchor expert on the use of archival materials for law enforcement purposes, leading to consulting opportunities with other libraries, historical societies, and law enforcement agencies seeking to develop their own capabilities for utilizing historical documents in criminal investigations. Her experience demonstrated that libraries could serve functions that extended far beyond traditional educational and cultural roles to include contributions to community safety and criminal justice. The publicity surrounding the Morrison case and related investigations brought increased attention to the Whitmore Public Library, attracting researchers, journalists, and law enforcement officials who were interested in examining other materials that might contain evidence of criminal activities or provide insights into historical patterns of organized crime in rural areas. This increased attention created new challenges for Janet and her staff, who had to balance legitimate research Interests with the need to protect the privacy rights of individuals whose papers were housed in the library's collections and who might not have anticipated that their personal materials would be used for law enforcement purposes. The library developed new policies and procedures for handling materials that might contain evidence of criminal activities while maintaining its traditional commitment to open access to information and historical research. The library's experience with criminal evidence and archival collections led to broader discussions within the library profession about the responsibilities and challenges that libraries faced when their collections included materials documenting illegal activities, and about the development of professional standards and legal protections that could help librarians navigate these complex situations while serving both scholarly researchers and law enforcement agencies. Janet's work with Detective Martinez continued for several years as they developed new cases based on information found in the library's archives and worked with other law enforcement agencies to share information about criminal networks that had operated across multiple jurisdictions and time periods. Their collaboration demonstrated that historical research and criminal investigation could complement each other in ways that served both scholarly understanding and practical law enforcement needs. The ongoing investigation of materials in the library's archives revealed that Whitmore's experience with organized criminal activities was not unique, and that many small communities had served as bases for criminal enterprises that had exploited rural areas' limited law enforcement resources and community members' reluctance to report criminal activities that involved prominent local residents or businesses. As Janet continued her work as head librarian, she maintained awareness that the library's collections might contain additional evidence of criminal activities that could be valuable for law enforcement purposes while serving the library's traditional functions of preserving historical materials and supporting scholarly research. Her experience had demonstrated that libraries could play important roles in maintaining community safety and supporting criminal justice efforts while preserving their fundamental commitments to intellectual freedom and open access to information. The Whitmore Public Library's transformation from a traditional repository of books and historical materials into a resource for criminal investigations reflected broader changes in how communities understood the relationships between historical preservation, law enforcement, and civic responsibility, demonstrating that institutions dedicated to preserving knowledge and memory could also contribute to protecting public safety and ensuring that criminal activities did not remain hidden indefinitely from justice and accountability. Asterisk. High in the Appalachian Mountains, where mist clings to ridgelines and valleys, hide settlements that seem untouched by the passage of decades. The village of Pine Hollow exists in a state of suspended animation between past and present. The community of 200 souls has occupied this mountain valley for over a century, their lives shaped by the rhythms of seasons, the challenges of subsistence farming, and the particular form of independence that develops in places where neighbors are separated by miles of steep terrain, and self-reliance is not just a philosophy, but a practical necessity. The village's isolation has preserved traditions, customs, and ways of life that have disappeared from more accessible communities, but it has also allowed secrets to accumulate like fallen leaves in hidden hollows, layer upon layer of unspoken knowledge that has been passed down through generations who understood that some things were better left undiscussed, even among themselves. Sheriff Tom Bradley had served Pine Hollow and the surrounding mountain communities for 18 years, elected to office by voters who valued his deep roots in the area and his understanding of the complex relationships, historical grievances, and unwritten rules that governed life in places where official law enforcement was often less important than community-based systems of justice and conflict resolution. Bradley's job required him to navigate carefully between his official responsibilities as a law enforcement officer and his unofficial role as a member of a community that had learned to handle many problems internally without involving outside authorities who might not understand local circumstances or respect the privacy and independence that mountain communities considered essential to their way of life. The sheriff's most persistent challenge involved a series of disappearances that had occurred over the past 15 years, events that followed patterns familiar to longtime residents, but difficult to explain to state police investigators or other outside officials who occasionally inquired about missing persons, reports that originated in Pine Hollow and the surrounding mountain settlements. These disappearances were not dramatic incidents that generated extensive search efforts or media attention, but rather quiet vanishings that occurred when individuals appeared to simply walk away from their lives in Pine Hollow, leaving behind few clues about their destinations or reasons for departing. The missing persons were typically people who had experienced conflicts with other community members, individuals who had violated unwritten social rules, or outsiders who had failed to integrate successfully into the tight-knit social networks that defined mountain community life. The first documented case in Sheriff Bradley's files involved the disappearance of Marcus Webb, a relative newcomer to Pine Hollow who had purchased an abandoned farm property with plans to establish an organic vegetable operation that would serve customers in distant cities willing to pay premium prices for produce grown using traditional methods in pristine mountain environments. Marcus had arrived in Pine Hollow in 2008 with considerable enthusiasm for mountain life and ambitious plans for agricultural enterprises that he believed would provide both personal fulfillment and economic opportunities for other community members who might be interested in participating in cooperative farming ventures. His background included agricultural education, business experience, and financial resources that seemed to position him well for success in his chosen endeavor. But Marcus's approach to farming and community relations reflected attitudes and assumptions that put him at odds with established patterns of mountain life, creating tensions that grew more serious as he attempted to implement changes that longtime residents viewed as threats to traditional ways of doing things. His emphasis on organic certification, marketing to urban customers, and cooperative business arrangements seemed to many community members like attempts to commercialize and exploit resources that they believed should remain under local control. Marcus's conflicts with other community members intensified when his farming operations began affecting water sources, road access, and land use patterns that had been stable for generations. His irrigation systems diverted water from streams that other farmers depended on for their own agricultural needs. His delivery trucks created traffic and noise on roads that had previously carried only local traffic, and his expansion plans required land acquisitions that displaced families who had lived on the same properties for decades. The disputes between Marcus and his neighbors followed escalating patterns that were familiar to Sheriff Bradley from previous conflicts in mountain communities, beginning with informal complaints and attempts at negotiation, progressing through increasingly hostile confrontations, and eventually reaching levels of animosity that threatened to result in violence or other serious consequences if not resolved through intervention by community leaders or law enforcement authorities. Sheriff Bradley attempted to mediate between Marcus and other community members, but his efforts were complicated by the fact that the conflicts involved fundamental differences in values, priorities, and visions for the future of Pine Hollow that could not be easily reconciled through compromise or legal procedures designed for more straightforward disputes about property rights or business practices. On November 12, 2010, Marcus Webb failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with a potential customer who had driven from the state capital to discuss purchasing arrangements for the following growing season. The customer waited at Marcus's farm for several hours before contacting Sheriff Bradley to report that Marcus seemed to have disappeared, leaving his farm equipment running, his house unlocked, and his business records scattered across his kitchen table as if he had been interrupted while working on financial planning. Sheriff Bradley's investigation revealed that Marcus's farm showed no signs of struggle or hasty departure, but rather appeared to have been abandoned in the middle of routine daily activities. His truck was parked in its usual location, his livestock were properly secured and fed, and his personal belongings remained in their normal places throughout his house. Most puzzling was the fact that Marcus had left behind cash, credit cards, and important documents that he would have needed if he had planned to travel or relocate to another area. The sheriff's interviews with other community members revealed that Marcus had been involved in increasingly bitter disputes with several neighbors during the weeks preceding his disappearance. But these conflicts had seemed to be following familiar patterns that usually resulted in compromise solutions or voluntary departure by newcomers who found mountain life more challenging than they had anticipated. More troubling were indirect suggestions from some residents that Marcus's disappearance might not have been entirely voluntary, though nobody was willing to provide specific information about potential criminal activities or to name individuals who might have been involved in causing Marcus's vanishing. The sheriff recognized these patterns of partial disclosure and strategic silence as typical of mountain communities, responses to events that residents preferred to handle through informal justice systems rather than official law enforcement procedures. Sheriff Bradley's investigation into Marcus Webb's disappearance was complicated by the community's collective reluctance to provide information that might result in outside law enforcement intervention in Pine Hollow's internal affairs, and by his own understanding that pressing too aggressively for information might damage his relationships with community members whose cooperation he needed for effective law enforcement in other situations. The case remained officially open, but practical investigation efforts were suspended when it became clear that further progress would require confrontational approaches that might create more problems than they solved for ongoing community safety and sheriff's department effectiveness in serving mountain communities that valued privacy and independence above cooperation with official authorities. Similar patterns characterized other disappearances that occurred in Pine Hollow during the following years, involving individuals who had experienced conflicts with established community members, violated social norms, or otherwise created situations that longtime residents viewed as threats to community stability and traditional ways of life. In 2012, Lisa Chun, a social worker attempting to establish services for elderly residents, disappeared after several months of increasingly hostile reception from community members who viewed her programs as unwanted intrusion by outside agencies. In 2014, Robert Martinez, a federal environmental inspector investigating water quality issues, vanished during a routine inspection trip that had generated opposition from residents concerned about government regulation of their land use practices. Each disappearance followed similar patterns. Individuals who had created conflicts or tensions within the community would simply vanish, leaving behind personal belongings and evidence of normal daily activities, but no clues about their destinations or the circumstances of their departure. Official investigations would be conducted, but they would be hampered by community members' reluctance to provide information, and by the practical difficulties of conducting comprehensive searches in mountainous terrain that offered countless locations where evidence could be concealed, or where accidents might occur without leaving discoverable traces. Sheriff Bradley gradually developed his own understanding of these disappearances, recognizing that they represented a form of community self-regulation that had evolved in response to the isolation and independence that characterized mountain life. The disappearances served to remove individuals who were perceived as threats to community stability, while the absence of evidence or witnesses prevented official law enforcement from taking actions that might disrupt established social relationships and traditional conflict resolution methods. Sheriff's position required him to balance his official responsibilities to investigate crimes and protect public safety with his practical understanding that attempting to solve cases through confrontational methods might damage his effectiveness in serving communities. That depended on his discretion and his respect for local customs and values. This balance became more difficult to maintain as outside attention to the disappearances increased, particularly after state police investigators began reviewing missing persons reports from mountain communities and identifying patterns that suggested possible criminal activity requiring more aggressive investigation methods than local law enforcement had employed. The state police investigation revealed that similar patterns of unexplained disappearances had occurred in mountain communities throughout the region, involving individuals who had been viewed as outsiders or troublemakers by established residents. The investigators theorized that these communities had developed informal systems for eliminating perceived threats through methods that ranged from intimidation and forced relocation to more extreme measures that might include violence or murder. Sheriff Bradley found himself caught between his loyalty to the mountain communities that had elected him and his professional obligations to cooperate with state police investigators who were pursuing cases that could result in arrests and prosecutions of community members whose support he needed for effective law enforcement in other situations. The investigations focus on Pine Hollow intensified when state police investigators discovered evidence suggesting that some disappearances had involved violence and that bodies might have been concealed in remote locations throughout the mountain region. This evidence included witness reports from individuals who had left mountain communities after observing suspicious activities, physical evidence collected from suspected crime scenes, and communications intercepted from community members discussing methods for dealing with problematic individuals. The state police investigation led to arrests of several Pine Hollow residents on charges related to conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and suspected involvement in the disappearances of Marcus Webb and other missing persons. These arrests created divisions within the community between residents who supported cooperation with law enforcement and those who viewed the investigation as an attack on community autonomy and traditional ways of life. Sheriff Bradley's role in these arrests and prosecutions damaged his relationships with many community members who felt betrayed by his cooperation with outside authorities, but it also demonstrated his commitment to upholding legal standards, even when doing so conflicted with community loyalties and political considerations. TRILS that resulted from the state police investigation revealed the extent to which some mountain communities had developed systems for eliminating perceived threats through violence, intimidation, and murder, while maintaining appearances of normal community life that concealed criminal activities from outside observation. The evidence presented in court documented a pattern of organized criminal activity that had been disguised as traditional community self-governance. Several defendants were convicted on charges related to the disappearances, though the complexity of proving specific criminal acts in cases where bodies had not been recovered and physical evidence was limited made successful prosecution difficult in some cases. The convictions that were obtained served to disrupt the criminal networks that had been operating in mountain communities while sending messages to other communities about the consequences of using violence to resolve conflicts with outsiders. The impact of the investigation and prosecutions on Pine Hollow and similar mountain communities was profound, disrupting traditional social relationships and forcing residents to reconsider their approaches to conflict resolution and community self-governance in ways that balanced legitimate needs for independence and privacy with legal requirements for respecting individual rights and cooperating with law enforcement authorities. Sheriff Bradley continued serving Pine Hollow after the investigation concluded, but his role had been fundamentally changed by the events that had forced him to choose between community loyalty and legal obligations. His experience demonstrated the complex challenges faced by law enforcement officers who served communities with strong traditions of independence and informal justice systems that sometimes conflicted with official legal procedures and standards. Cases that had been solved through the state police investigation provided closure for families who had lost relatives to unexplained disappearances. But they also revealed the extent to which isolation and traditional ways of life could be exploited by individuals willing to use violence to maintain their control over community affairs and eliminate perceived threats to their asterisk. Port Catherine sits where the Blackwater River meets the Atlantic Ocean. Its natural harbor protected by barrier islands that have sheltered fishing boats and merchant vessels for over 3 centuries. The town's waterfront district preserves the architectural legacy of maritime commerce from earlier eras, with brick warehouses, wooden piers, and captains' houses that speak to the prosperity that once flowed through this coastal gateway to inland communities. Spread across river valleys and mountain regions, the harbor's working life has changed dramatically over the decades, as container ships now dock at deep-water facilities built on reclaimed land, while the old waterfront has been transformed into a mixture of tourist attractions, restaurants, and maritime museums that celebrate the area's seafaring heritage. But beneath the cheerful facade of adaptive reuse and historical preservation, the harbor retains memories of darker chapters in its long history of connecting land and sea, legitimate commerce and criminal enterprise. Harbor Master Douglas Chun had overseen Port Catherine's maritime operations for 27 years, managing the complex coordination required to accommodate commercial shipping, recreational boating, fishing vessels, and the tourist boats that carried visitors on scenic cruises around the harbor and along the nearby coastline. His position required intimate knowledge of tides, weather patterns, navigation hazards, and the intricate web of federal, state, and local regulations that governed maritime activities in one of the region's busiest coastal ports. But Chun's long tenure in the Harbor Master's office had also made him aware of activities that occurred beyond the scope of official maritime commerce, operations that used the harbor's legitimate shipping infrastructure to facilitate illegal enterprises that had learned to exploit the complexity and international scope of modern port operations to move contraband, launder money, and conduct criminal business, away from the scrutiny of law enforcement agencies that lacked the specialized knowledge needed to detect suspicious activities among the thousands of legitimate transactions that occurred monthly in a busy commercial port. The Harbor Master's concerns about potential criminal activities had developed gradually over his decades of service, beginning with occasional observations of unusual shipping patterns, irregular documentation, and vessel movements that seemed inconsistent with the legitimate maritime business that constituted the vast majority of harbor traffic. These observations had accumulated into patterns that suggested systematic criminal operations that used Port Catherine's harbor as a transit point for illegal activities that connected criminal organizations operating in multiple countries and regions. First concrete indication that criminal enterprises were exploiting the harbor's facilities came through Chun's investigation of documentation irregularities associated with cargo shipments handled by Meridian Shipping Company, a firm that had established operations in Port Catherine during the early 1990s and had gradually expanded its business to become one of the harbor's largest private shipping operations. Asterisk. Meridian Shipping specialized in handling cargo that required expedited processing and minimal bureaucratic delay, serving customers who were willing to pay premium rates for shipping services that could move goods quickly through ports without the extensive documentation and inspection procedures that characterized routine commercial shipping. The company's marketing emphasized discretion, efficiency, and the ability to handle unusual cargo, requirements that might not be accommodated easily by larger shipping companies with more standardized procedures. Chun's review of Meridian Shipping's operations revealed patterns that seemed inconsistent with legitimate commercial shipping, including cargo manifests that listed goods in vague terms that made inspection and verification difficult. shipping schedules that avoided the normal working hours, when port inspectors and customs officials were most likely to be present, and financial arrangements that involved cash payments and offshore banking systems. That made it difficult to trace the sources and destinations of funds used to pay for shipping services. More troubling were Chun's observations of the cargo handling procedures used by Meridian Shipping, which involved private loading and unloading operations conducted by the company's own personnel rather than the union dock workers who normally handled cargo operations in the harbor. These private operations occurred during evening and weekend hours when port supervision was minimal, and they involved cargo containers that were sealed and marked with codes that did not correspond to standard shipping industry practices. The harbor master's concerns about Meridian Shipping's activities led him to conduct discreet investigations into the company's business relationships, shipping destinations, and the backgrounds of key personnel involved in its operations. These investigations revealed connections to business entities and individuals who had been associated with criminal enterprises in other ports, and who appeared to be using Port Catherine as one node in a network of shipping operations that facilitated illegal activities across multiple jurisdictions. Chun's investigation was complicated by the limitations of his official authority, which extended primarily to safety and navigation issues rather than law enforcement activities that would require specialized training and legal authorization that harbor masters did not typically possess. His concerns about potential criminal activities needed to be reported to appropriate law enforcement agencies, but doing so required evidence that went beyond suspicious patterns and circumstantial observations to include concrete proof of illegal activities that could support criminal investigations and prosecutions. Harbor Master's dilemma was resolved when he discovered evidence of drug trafficking operations that used Meridian Shipping's facilities to import illegal substances concealed within legitimate cargo shipments that were processed through the company's expedited handling procedures. This evidence came through Chun's investigation of a shipping container that had been damaged during unloading operations, revealing contents that included both legitimate commercial goods and packages of illegal drugs that had been concealed within the legitimate cargo. Chun's discovery of drug trafficking evidence provided the concrete proof needed to justify reporting his concerns to federal law enforcement agencies with jurisdiction over maritime criminal activities, including the Drug Enforcement Administration, U.S. Customs Service, and Coast Guard units specializing in port security and criminal investigations. These agencies had the legal authority and specialized capabilities needed to conduct comprehensive investigations into criminal enterprises that exploited commercial shipping infrastructure for illegal purposes. The federal investigation into Meridian Shipping's operations revealed the extent to which the company had been serving as a front for criminal enterprises that used Port Catherine's harbor to facilitate drug trafficking, money laundering, and other illegal activities that generated substantial profits while exploiting the legitimate shipping infrastructure that supported the region's economic development and international trade relationships. The investigation disclosed that Meridian Shipping had been established specifically to serve criminal organizations that needed reliable methods for moving illegal drugs, contraband goods, and criminal proceeds between the United States and criminal enterprises operating in South America, Europe, and Asia. The company's operations had been carefully designed to blend criminal activities with legitimate shipping business in ways that made detection difficult for law enforcement agencies that lacked detailed knowledge of normal shipping industry practices and procedures. Federal investigators revealed that Meridian Shipping's criminal activities had been protected by corruption that extended into various levels of port management, customs inspection, and local law enforcement agencies that had been paid to ignore suspicious activities or to provide advance warning of law enforcement operations that might threaten the company's illegal enterprises. This corruption had been facilitated by the substantial profits generated by drug trafficking operations that provided resources for bribing officials and maintaining the legitimate business infrastructure needed to conceal criminal activities. Investigation also revealed that several unexplained disappearances and deaths in Port Catherine during the previous decade had been connected to Meridian Shipping's operations, as the company had used violence and intimidation to protect its criminal enterprises from potential witnesses, competitors, and law enforcement investigations. These crimes had included the murders of dock workers, customs inspectors, and other individuals who had discovered evidence of illegal activities or who had threatened to report criminal behavior to law enforcement authorities. Among the victims was James Morrison, a customs inspector who had disappeared in 1998 after raising questions about irregularities in cargo documentation processed by Meridian Shipping. Morrison's body had never been recovered, but federal investigators developed evidence indicating that he had been murdered after discovering drug shipments concealed within legitimate cargo, and that his death had been staged to appear accidental in order to prevent law enforcement investigation into the circumstances of his disappearance. Federal investigation led to arrests and prosecutions of numerous individuals involved in Meridian Shipping's criminal operations, including company executives, dock workers, customs officials, and members of criminal organizations that had used the company's services to facilitate drug trafficking and money laundering activities. These prosecutions disrupted criminal networks that had been operating for over a decade while generating hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profits. Harbor Master Chun's role in exposing Meridian Shipping's criminal activities established him as an expert on maritime security issues and port-based criminal enterprises, leading to consulting opportunities with other ports, law enforcement agencies, and international organizations seeking to improve their capabilities for detecting and preventing criminal exploitation of commercial shipping infrastructure. Asterisk. The Meridian Shipping case also revealed the importance of cooperation between maritime industry professionals and law enforcement agencies in detecting criminal activities that exploited the complexity and international scope of modern shipping operations. Chun's specialized knowledge of normal port operations had been essential for recognizing suspicious patterns that might not have been apparent to law enforcement officers without detailed understanding of legitimate shipping industry practices. The cleanup of criminal activities in Port Catherine's harbor required years of sustained effort to rebuild legitimate shipping operations, restore public confidence in port security, and establish new procedures for preventing criminal exploitation of maritime infrastructure. These efforts involved cooperation between federal law enforcement agencies, port management, legitimate shipping companies, and labor organizations representing dock workers and other maritime industry employees. The harbor's recovery also required addressing the economic impact of disrupting criminal operations that had provided employment and generated revenue for businesses and individuals who had become dependent on illegal activities, either directly through participation in criminal enterprises or indirectly through economic relationships with businesses that had been fronts for criminal organizations. Port Catherine's experience with criminal exploitation of its harbor infrastructure provided valuable lessons for other ports seeking to balance the economic benefits of international commerce with the security challenges created by criminal organizations that sought to exploit legitimate shipping operations for illegal purposes. The case demonstrated the importance of maintaining vigilance against criminal infiltration while preserving the efficiency and accessibility that made ports valuable economic assets for regional development. Chun's continued service as harbor master reflected his commitment to maintaining Port Catherine's role as a legitimate gateway for international commerce while ensuring that its facilities could not be exploited by criminal enterprises seeking to use maritime infrastructure for illegal activities. His experience had demonstrated that effective port security required ongoing cooperation between maritime industry professionals, law enforcement agencies, and community members committed to preserving the economic and social benefits of legitimate maritime commerce. The harbor's transformation from a facility that had been infiltrated by criminal enterprises to one that served as a model for port security and legitimate maritime operations represented a significant achievement in community development and law enforcement cooperation. Port Catherine had demonstrated that ports could maintain their economic vitality while implementing security measures that prevented criminal exploitation of maritime infrastructure. Waterfront districts continued development as a center for tourism, recreation, and legitimate maritime businesses reflected the community's success in overcoming the challenges created by criminal infiltration of port operations. The restaurants, museums, and recreational facilities that occupied former warehouse and shipping facilities served as reminders that criminal enterprises could be replaced by legitimate businesses that contributed to community prosperity and quality of life. As Chun approached retirement after decades of service to Port Catherine's maritime community, he reflected on the complex challenges of managing port operations that served both local economic development and international commerce while maintaining security against criminal exploitation. His experience had demonstrated that effective port management required understanding not only the technical aspects of maritime operations but also the social and economic factors that made ports attractive to both legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises. The harbor master's files documenting the investigation and cleanup of criminal activities in Port Catherine remained as permanent records of the community's efforts to maintain the economic benefits of maritime commerce while protecting against criminal infiltration. These records served as resources for other ports facing similar challenges and as reminders of the ongoing vigilance required to prevent criminal exploitation of legitimate maritime infrastructure. Port Catherine's harbor continued to serve as a gateway between land and sea, connecting regional communities with international markets through legitimate commerce that contributed to economic development and cultural exchange. The tides that had carried both legitimate vessels and criminal enterprises continued their ancient rhythm, but the community had learned to distinguish between activities that contributed to prosperity and those that threatened the social and economic foundations of maritime life. The empty piers and warehouses that had once sheltered criminal activities now hosted legitimate businesses, cultural events, and recreational activities that celebrated Port Catherine's maritime heritage while ensuring that its harbor facilities served the community's long-term interests in economic development, public safety, and environmental protection. The Riverside Grand Hotel rises 7 stories above the tree-lined avenue that forms the heart of downtown Millbrook. Its Edwardian facade and ornate lobby reflecting the optimistic prosperity of the early 20th century when the hotel was built to serve railroad passengers, traveling businessmen, and the occasional tourist drawn to the scenic river valley that surrounded the growing commercial center. For over a century, the Grand Hotel has provided accommodation for thousands of guests whose reasons for visiting Millbrook have ranged from routine business travel to family celebrations, romantic getaways, and the various personal circumstances that bring people to small cities where they can find comfortable lodging, excellent dining, and the kind of attentive service that larger urban hotels often cannot provide due to their size and impersonal operational procedures. The hotel's guest register, preserved in leather-bound volumes that stretch back to opening day in 1912, contains signatures from traveling salesmen, government officials, entertainers, and business executives whose names appear alongside those of ordinary families celebrating anniversaries, attending graduations, or simply seeking weekend escapes from their daily routines in nearby cities and towns. But interspersed among these routine entries are names and stories that reflect the hotel's inadvertent role as a stage for human dramas that have extended far beyond simple hospitality to include mysteries, crimes, and tragic events that have left permanent impressions on the building and the staff members who have worked there through decades of changing social conditions and evolving expectations about privacy, security, and the responsibilities of hospitality businesses to their guests and communities. Maria Santos had worked at the Riverside Grand Hotel for 34 years, beginning as a housekeeping assistant and gradually advancing to her current position as head of guest services, a role that required her to coordinate all aspects of guest experiences from arrival through departure. Her long tenure had given her intimate knowledge of the hotel's operations, its physical quirks and hidden spaces, and the subtle signs that experienced hospitality professionals learn to recognize when guests are experiencing difficulties that go beyond routine travel inconveniences. Maria's position had also made her aware of incidents and patterns that seemed to occur with unusual frequency at the Grand Hotel, events that individually could be attributed to coincidence or misfortune, but collectively suggested underlying factors that created conditions favorable to criminal activity, personal tragedy, and the kind of mysterious occurrences that gave the hotel a reputation for harboring secrets among longtime staff members and regular guests who had observed the establishment's operations over extended periods. The most persistent pattern in Maria's experience involved guests who checked into the hotel under apparently normal circumstances but then vanished during their stays, leaving behind personal belongings, unpaid bills, and no explanation for their sudden departures. These disappearances occurred with sufficient regularity to suggest systematic causes rather than random incidents, though identifying specific factors responsible for the pattern proved difficult due to the diverse backgrounds and circumstances of the missing guests. The earliest documented case in Maria's memory involved William Parker, a pharmaceutical sales representative who had disappeared from room 412 during a business trip to Millbrook in March 1995. Parker had arrived on a Tuesday evening, checked in using standard corporate travel procedures, and attended scheduled meetings with local physicians and pharmacy owners on Wednesday and Thursday of that week. Parker's colleagues expected him to return home on Friday, but he failed to appear for his scheduled checkout time and did not respond to phone calls or messages left at the hotel's front desk. Hotel staff found his room undisturbed except for Parker's absence, with his luggage, business materials, and personal effects arranged as if he had planned to return after a brief outing. Most puzzling was the condition of Parker's room, which showed no signs of hasty departure, struggle, or unusual activity. His clothes remained in the dresser drawers, his toiletries were organized on the bathroom counter, and his pharmaceutical sample cases were lined up beside the television, exactly as he had arranged them upon arrival. His car remained in the hotel parking garage, keys still in his possession according to the hotel's key tracking system. Maria's investigation into Parker's disappearance revealed that he had been conducting routine business activities throughout his stay, following normal patterns for pharmaceutical sales representatives who visited small cities to meet with healthcare providers and promote new medications. His appointment schedule showed no unusual meetings or activities that might have created personal or professional complications. Local police investigation into Parker's disappearance was thorough but inconclusive, revealing no evidence of foul play, financial problems, or personal circumstances that might have motivated him to abandon his business trip and disappear voluntarily. Parker's family and colleagues describe him as reliable and content with his life and work, making voluntary disappearance seem inconsistent with his personality and circumstances. Asterisk, the Parker case remained unsolved, but it established a pattern that would be repeated numerous times over the subsequent decades, involving guests who seemed to simply vanish from their rooms without explanation, leaving behind possessions and circumstances that suggested they had not planned to depart permanently from their normal lives and responsibilities. The second major case in Maria's experience occurred in August 1998 when Dorothy Walsh, a retired librarian researching local history, disappeared from room 237 during what was supposed to be a week-long visit to examine historical documents in Millbrook's archives and interview longtime residents about the community's past. Asterisk. Dorothy had been an enthusiastic and organized researcher who spent her days visiting the Historical Society, the public library, and various community members who possessed knowledge about local history that she was documenting for a book about small-town life in the mid-20th century. Her research had been proceeding successfully, and she had expressed satisfaction with the information she was gathering and the cooperation she was receiving from local residents. On Thursday morning of her planned week-long stay, Dorothy failed to appear for a scheduled interview with a local historian who had arranged to share family documents and photographs that were relevant to her research project. When Dorothy did not respond to phone calls or messages, hotel staff checked her room and found it empty except for her research materials, which were scattered across the desk and bed as if she had been working on organizing information late into the evening. Dorothy's research notes revealed the systematic and thorough approach she had been taking to documenting local history, but they also contained references to information that seemed to disturb or concern her, though the nature of her concerns was not immediately clear from the fragmentary notes and questions that she had written in the margins of various documents. Among Dorothy's research materials were photocopied documents, interview transcripts, and handwritten notes that suggested she had been investigating aspects of Millbrook's history that involved controversial or sensitive topics, including business practices, political relationships, and social conflicts that had occurred during earlier decades when community members who were still living had been involved in activities that they might prefer to keep private. The police investigation into Dorothy's disappearance revealed that her research had led her to uncover information about criminal activities, corruption, and violence that had occurred in Millbrook during the 1940s and 1950s, including incidents that had been covered up or ignored by law enforcement officials who were either incompetent or complicit in the criminal enterprises that Dorothy had been documenting through her historical research. Dorothy's notes indicated that she had planned to include this information in her book about local history, potentially exposing criminal activities and naming individuals who had been involved in illegal enterprises that had generated substantial profits while corrupting local government, business, and social institutions. Her research had apparently attracted attention from individuals who viewed her historical investigation as a threat to reputations, financial interests, and family legacies that had been built on concealed criminal foundations. The third significant case occurred in November 2001 when Robert Sterling, a federal auditor investigating financial irregularities in local government agencies, disappeared from room 156 during what was supposed to be a routine audit assignment that had brought him to Millbrook to examine municipal records and interview city officials about budget procedures and financial management practices. Sterling's audit work had revealed discrepancies in city financial records that suggested possible fraud, embezzlement, or other criminal misuse of public funds by officials who had been manipulating budget procedures to divert money for personal use or to benefit private interests that had been receiving city contracts and services through corrupt arrangements that violated state and federal laws governing municipal operations. The auditor's preliminary findings had been reported to his supervisors at the state level, but his disappearance occurred before he could complete his investigation and file the comprehensive report that would have provided evidence for criminal prosecutions of local officials who had been involved in the financial irregularities that had prompted the audit. Sterling's room at the Grand Hotel contained audit working papers, financial documents, and computer files that documented the systematic nature of the financial crimes he had been investigating, but the disappearance of the auditor himself prevented the completion of legal proceedings that might have resulted in criminal charges. against prominent community members who had been involved in corrupt activities that had diverted substantial amounts of public money for private benefit. Maria's analysis of these three cases revealed patterns that suggested the disappearances were not random events, but rather systematic responses to threats posed by individuals whose professional activities or personal investigations had uncovered information that certain community members wanted to keep hidden from public scrutiny and law enforcement attention. The missing guests had all been conducting activities that involved examining records, interviewing local residents, or investigating activities that had the potential to expose criminal behavior, corruption, or other illegal activities that had been concealed for years or decades by individuals with the resources and motivation to eliminate threats to their interests and reputations. Maria's concerns about these patterns led her to begin her own informal investigation into the circumstances surrounding the disappearances, using her position at the hotel to examine guest records, staff observations, and other information that might reveal connections between the missing persons and local individuals or organizations that might have had motives for wanting to prevent their investigations from proceeding or becoming public. Her investigation revealed that each of the missing guests had received visits from local residents during their stays at the hotel, visits that had been arranged through phone calls or messages that could not be traced to specific individuals or organizations. These visits had occurred shortly before the guests' disappearances, suggesting that they might have been lured away from the hotel under false pretenses or eliminated after being confronted about their investigative activities. Maria's findings attracted attention from state police investigators who had been reviewing unsolved missing persons cases throughout the region, looking for patterns that might indicate serial criminal activity or organized efforts to eliminate individuals who posed threats to criminal enterprises that operated across multiple jurisdictions and time periods. The state police investigation revealed that the Grand Hotel had been targeted by criminal organizations that monitored guest activities and identified individuals whose work or interests might threaten criminal enterprises that had been operating in Millbrook and surrounding communities for decades. These criminal organizations had developed systematic methods for eliminating threats through kidnapping, murder, and body disposal that prevented law enforcement from developing evidence needed for criminal prosecutions. The investigation led to arrests and prosecutions of individuals who had been involved in the disappearances of Parker, Walsh, Sterling, and several other guests whose cases had not been officially connected until the state police investigation revealed the patterns that linked them to a criminal conspiracy that had been operating for over a decade. The revelations about criminal activities at the Grand Hotel shocked the Millbrook community and led to comprehensive reforms in hotel security procedures, guest protection protocols, and cooperation between hospitality businesses and law enforcement agencies responsible for investigating criminal activities that exploited the tourism and business travel infrastructure that supported the local economy. Maria's role in exposing the criminal conspiracy earned her recognition as an expert on hospitality industry security issues, but it also made her aware of the complex responsibilities that hotel employees bore for protecting guests from criminal activities that might target individuals based on their professional activities, personal investigations, or knowledge that threatened criminal enterprises. The Grand Hotel's recovery from the criminal infiltration required years of effort to rebuild its reputation as a safe and welcoming accommodation for legitimate travelers, while implementing security measures that could protect guests without creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that would discourage tourism and business travel that were essential for the local economy. The hotel's transformation included physical security improvements, staff training programs, and cooperation with law enforcement agencies that provided resources for identifying and responding to potential threats against guests whose activities might attract attention from criminal organizations seeking to protect their illegal enterprises through violence and intimidation. As Maria continued her work at the Grand Hotel, She maintained awareness that hospitality businesses could be exploited by criminal organizations, seeking to identify and eliminate threats to their operations, and she worked to ensure that the hotel's guests could pursue their legitimate activities without fear of criminal victimization that had once made the Grand Hotel a dangerous place for anyone whose work or interests might threaten established criminal enterprises in Millbrook and the surrounding region.